Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the softest chair in the room, because tonight we are going somewhere strange. Not strange in the way a ruined castle is strange, or a battlefield, or a forgotten tomb. We are going somewhere many of us still remember, even if we do not always think of it as history yet. We're going back to the America of dial-up tones, office parks, glowing computer monitors, conference rooms with whiteboards full of impossible plans, and ordinary people who began to believe that the future had finally learned their names. Tonight we are not going to a king's court. We are not going to a frontier cabin, or a medieval village, or a ship crossing the Atlantic in rough weather. We are going to a cubicle under fluorescent lights in 1999. We're going to a starter apartment in San Jose, where 3 young programmers are sleeping on mattresses on the floor because the company might go public next year. We're going to a suburban kitchen, where a father reads the business section before work and wonders if he should move more of his retirement money into technology stocks. We're going to a college dorm where a student with no business experience at all looks at a website loading slowly on a beige desktop computer and thinks, maybe this is how I get rich. We are going to a moment in American history when the old rules seemed tired, slow, even embarrassing, and a new set of rules appeared to arrive with a blinking cursor and a cheerful little modem sound. And here is the thing that still feels hard to believe. For a brief time, millions of people were encouraged to think that the American dream had been upgraded, not earned slowly across decades. Not built through a steady job, a mortgage, savings, patience, and a little luck. Upgraded, like software. Faster, cleaner, more exciting, available to anyone who could get online early enough and recognise the future before their neighbour did. In the old version of the dream, your parents told you to work hard, buy a home, keep your job, save for retirement, and do not gamble with what you cannot afford to lose. In the new version, people were told that caution was for those who did not understand the internet. Patience was for those who were already behind. Profit did not matter yet. Revenue could wait. A company did not need to make money today if it had traffic, users, attention, a good story, and a stock ticker that climbed every morning like it was being pulled upward by something invisible. Stay with me tonight, because by the time we move through this story, the dot-com bubble will not look like just a stock market event. It will look like something more personal than that. It will look like a national mood, a sales pitch, a workplace revolution, a retirement plan, a housing pressure, a belief system. A quiet rearranging of what Americans thought work was for, what risk was supposed to mean, and who deserved to win. And when it broke, it did not only wipe numbers off a screen, it left people with empty stock options, vanished savings, office buildings with the light still on but no one inside, and a question that has not really gone away. What happens to a country when the dream it sells to ordinary people turns out to be someone else's exit strategy? Before we step into that world, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed with the room already dark? Are you on a couch, half awake, letting the day loosen its grip a little? Are you old enough to remember the sound of a modem connecting? That strange mechanical chatter that made the internet feel less like a place and more like a machine waking up in the next room? Or are you hearing about this period as something your parents or grandparents lived through? A time of oversized desktop computers, plastic CD-ROMs from AOL arriving in the mail, and websites that looked like they had been assembled by someone who had just discovered colour for the first time. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history that moves quietly through ordinary rooms and ordinary lives instead of only through famous names and official speeches, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it. When some detail makes you pause, or remember something, or realise that a period you thought was just recent business history was actually a human story all along. And if you want to share where you are listening from tonight, or whether you remember the dot-com years yourself, leave it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those, especially when people bring their own memories to a story like this. History is not only what happened far away. Sometimes it is the sound of the computer your family kept in the corner of the living room. Sometimes it is the first time someone told you that everything was about to change. So dim the lights a little if you can. Let the room get quiet. Let the glow of whatever screen you're using become part of the story, because that glow is where this begins. Not with the crash, not with the ruined companies, not with the layoffs and the headlines and the shocked analysts pretending they had always known it was unsustainable. It begins earlier, when the light from the screen looked like opportunity. Picture America in the middle of the 1990s. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union was gone. The long anxiety that had shaped so much of the 20th century had faded into something that felt, for many Americans, like victory. The economy was expanding. Unemployment was falling. Inflation seemed under control. Cable television was full of confident voices explaining markets to people who had never cared about markets before. The stock ticker had become a kind of background music for the professional class. Offices had computers now. Homes were getting them. Schools were building computer labs. Parents who had grown up with typewriters were telling their children that computer skills mattered, even when they did not fully understand what those skills were. There was a feeling in the air that the country had reached the end of one historical road and was about to begin another. The internet was not yet the smooth, invisible layer of life that it is now. It was not in everyone's pocket. It was not where you did your banking, your shopping, your dating, your work, your maps, your photographs, your news, your arguments, and your late-night worrying. It was a place you went to slowly. You connected to it. You waited for it. It made sounds. Pages loaded line by line. Images appeared from the top down as if someone were lowering a curtain very slowly. You could not use the phone while someone was online. A household had to negotiate access to the internet the way earlier households had negotiated access to the family car. It was limited, awkward, often frustrating, and still it felt miraculous. People who used it in those years remember the strangeness of realizing that distance had changed. You could sit in Ohio and read something posted by a stranger in California. You could send a message across the country without buying a stamp. You could join a forum devoted to some narrow interest that no one in your town cared about. You could order a book without going to a bookstore. You could look at a company's website and feel, without quite knowing why, that business itself was being pulled out of its old buildings and placed into a new, weightless space. It is easy now to laugh at the clumsy graphics, the slow connections, the bright buttons, the under-construction signs, the spinning icons, the awkward company names with capital letters in the middle. But at the time, it was not funny. It was proof that something had opened. And when something opens in America, money arrives quickly. The first great signal came in August of 1995, when Netscape went public. Netscape was not a household name in the way later internet companies would become, but its browser helped ordinary people move through the early web. The company was young, very young. By the standards of old American business, it was almost a child. It had not built railroads. It had not spent generations manufacturing cars or selling appliances or insuring homes. It had not earned its place through decades of profits. It had a browser, talent, momentum, and the aura of being early. When its stock began trading, the price surged. People looked at that first day and saw more than a successful public offering. They saw a door. A small group of insiders and early employees could become rich almost overnight, because the market believed in what the internet might become. That is where the mood begins to shift. Not all at once, not for everyone, but clearly enough that people started to notice. The stock market had always rewarded growth, but now growth itself seemed to be redefined. A company did not need to prove that it could make money in the old way. It needed to prove that it could scale. That word became one of the quiet passwords of the period. Scale. It meant a company could grow quickly without building factories in every city or hiring a traditional sales force in every state. A website could reach millions. A digital service could spread faster than a physical business. A small team in an office park could claim with a straight face that it was not building a company so much as capturing a market that did not fully exist yet. There is a particular kind of danger in being partly right. The internet really was important. It really did change commerce, communication, media, finance, advertising, music, work, and the shape of everyday life. The people who said it would transform the world were not wrong. That is what made the bubble so powerful. A foolish idea can be dismissed. A true idea taken too far is much harder to resist. The internet was real. The possibilities were real. Some companies born in that era would survive and become central to modern life. But around that truth grew a layer of exaggeration, then a layer of speculation, then a layer of pressure, then a layer of national fantasy so thick that it became difficult to tell where innovation ended and gambling began. You can see this most clearly in the language of the time. Businesses were no longer simply businesses. They were disruptors. Markets were not served. They were conquered. Losses were not losses. They were investments in growth. Advertising costs were not spending. They were customer acquisition. A company selling pet supplies online was not just selling pet supplies online. It was positioned as part of an inevitable shift in how Americans would buy everything. A grocery delivery company was not just delivering groceries. It was supposedly replacing the supermarket. A website with a funny name and a Super Bowl commercial was not just a risky startup. It was proof that the old economy was being humiliated by the new one in real time. For the people inside it, the experience could be intoxicating. Imagine being 25 years old and receiving stock options at a company that barely existed 2 years earlier. Imagine walking into an office where no one wore suits, where the hours were long but the atmosphere made exhaustion feel like belonging. There were free snacks, late nights, Nerf toys, exposed brick if the company could afford it, folding tables if it could not, and a strange sense that normal adulthood had been suspended. You were not supposed to think about pensions, because pensions belonged to the old economy. You were not supposed to worry about job security, because the company was going to go public. You were not supposed to ask when the business would become profitable, because that question marked you as someone who did not get it. You were building the future. The future did not fill out paperwork in triplicate. But outside the startup offices, the dream was spreading in a different form. It reached teachers, dentists, retirees, accountants, airline pilots, small business owners, and people who had never once imagined themselves as investors. The 401k had already moved more responsibility for retirement from employers to workers. Instead of a guaranteed pension that promised a stable income later in life, more Americans had accounts tied to the stock market. This mattered. It meant that the rising market was no longer an abstract story about wealthy people downtown. It was connected to the retirement hopes of ordinary households. When technology stocks rose, people felt richer. When mutual funds reported strong returns, people felt smarter. When neighbours mentioned the shares they had bought, it became harder to stay cautious without feeling foolish. This is an important part of the story, because the dot-com bubble did not destroy the American dream by simply making some investors lose money. Market crashes had happened before. Speculation was not new. America had lived through land bubbles, railroad bubbles, Florida real estate fever, the 1929 crash, savings and loan failures, and many smaller episodes of greed and disappointment. What made this moment different was the way speculation attached itself to the language of progress. People were not only buying stocks, they were buying participation in the next America. They were told, directly and indirectly, that those who failed to participate would be left behind. To hesitate was not merely conservative, it was backward. To ask for profits was not prudent, it was old thinking. To keep your money in safer places while internet stocks doubled and tripled was to feel like the future was happening without you. There is a scene I want you to hold for a moment. It is not dramatic. It would not appear in a movie trailer. A man sits at a kitchen table in 1999 with a newspaper open beside a cup of coffee. His children are upstairs getting ready for school. His wife is reminding someone to find their shoes. The radio is on low. He turns to the financial pages, or maybe he logs in through a slow connection to check a brokerage account. He is not a Wall Street trader. He's not reckless by nature. He's worked for years. He has done most things right. But everywhere he looks, people are making money faster than wages can earn it. A co-worker bought shares in a company he barely understands and now talks about retiring early. A neighbour refinanced and invested. Television guests say the internet is rewriting the economy. His retirement account has grown in a way that feels unreal, but also comforting. College tuition is rising. Home prices in the best school districts are not getting easier. His parents had a pension. He has a portfolio. And so, slowly, without thinking of himself as a gambler, he begins to accept more risk. That is how the American dream changed shape. Not in speeches, not in one law, not in one boardroom. It changed in small decisions made under pressure. It changed when wages felt too slow and assets felt fast. It changed when a stable job no longer seemed like enough to guarantee the life people had been promised. It changed when the path to security began to look less like work and more like timing. Buy early. Join early. Exercise options early. Get in before the IPO. Get in before everyone else understands. The dream became less about building a life brick by brick, and more about catching a wave before it broke. The tragedy is that some people really did catch it. That made the story harder to doubt. There were young engineers who became millionaires. There were founders who went from obscurity to magazine covers. There were venture capitalists who made fortunes. There were administrative assistants at the right company whose stock options briefly looked like a ticket into a different class. There were ordinary investors who bought early and sold before the collapse. These people existed, and because they existed, the dream seemed provable. Every bubble needs examples. It needs just enough winners to make everyone else believe that losing is a personal failure of timing rather than a structural feature of the game. By late 1999, the mood had become almost feverish. The Nasdaq, heavy with technology companies, was rising at a pace that made older investors nervous and newer investors impatient for more. Financial television turned market movement into daily entertainment. Magazines placed young founders on covers as if they were not merely business people, but signs of evolution. Companies with little revenue and no profits bought expensive advertising slots during the Super Bowl because attention itself had become a kind of currency. Office space in technology corridors filled quickly. Recruiters called people who were not looking for jobs. A person could leave one startup on Friday and join another on Monday with a better title and more options. In some places, especially around Silicon Valley, the pressure moved into housing, restaurants, traffic, schools, and the mood of daily life. The future was not evenly distributed, but in certain zip codes it was driving up the rent. It is tempting to tell this story as a comedy of foolishness, and there is plenty in it that looks foolish now. The sock puppet mascot, the companies that spent heavily to sell products at a loss, the business plans built on the assumption that the internet had repealed basic arithmetic, the analysts who justified valuations that made no sense unless the future arrived perfectly and immediately, the investors who bought because a company had .com in its name. But laughing too much lets us stand too far away. The more useful question is not why people were stupid. Many were not. The more useful question is why the story was so persuasive to so many people at once. Part of the answer is that the old American dream was already under strain. Long before the bubble burst, many families were living with a quiet mismatch between what they had been promised and what they could afford. Healthcare costs were rising. College was becoming more expensive. Secure pensions were fading for many private sector workers. Manufacturing jobs that had supported families for decades were no longer the unquestioned foundation of middle-class life in many towns. Credit was easier to get, but that did not mean life was easier to pay for. The house, the degree, the retirement, the stable upward path from one generation to the next, all of it was still held up as normal, but it was becoming harder to reach through wages alone. Into that gap came the market, smiling. Into that gap came the internet, glowing. Into that gap came a new promise that did not say the old dream was dead. It said the old dream had found a shortcut. You could still have the house, the retirement, the college fund, the freedom, the sense that your children would do better. You simply needed to understand where growth was going. You needed to stop thinking like the past. You needed to believe that the network would reward those brave enough to move first. This is why the dot-com bubble belongs in history, not just finance. It was not only about companies, it was about trust. Trust in experts, trust in employers, trust in retirement accounts, trust in the idea that innovation would lift ordinary people rather than use their hope as fuel. It was about the moment when technology became not only a set of tools, but a national mood. It was about the strange emotional bargain Americans were asked to make at the end of the 20th century. Accept more risk and call it freedom. And for a while it felt wonderful. That is the part we need to be honest about. Bubbles are not experienced as disasters while they are inflating. They are experienced as confirmation. People felt energetic, smart, early, chosen. The office lights stayed on late, but that was because something big was happening. The stock price rose, and that meant the work mattered. The website got more users, and that meant the plan was working. A company lost money, but that meant it was growing. A young founder spoke in strange phrases about eyeballs, portals, stickiness, and first mover advantage, and people nodded because everyone was learning the vocabulary at the same time. Even doubt began to sound old-fashioned. So before we talk about the collapse, before the red screens and the layoffs and the vanished paper fortunes, we have to sit for a while inside the belief itself. We have to understand the ordinary people who entered it, not because they were cartoonishly greedy, but because the country around them kept saying that history had accelerated and they had better keep up. We have to understand the young worker who accepted a lower salary for stock options that might someday be worth more than a house. We have to understand the investor who felt irresponsible for not buying technology funds. We have to understand the founder who confused attention with loyalty, growth with stability, and publicity with proof. We have to understand the parents who saw their children moving west, joining companies with names that sounded unserious, and wondered if this was simply what ambition looked like now. The story begins there, in the years before the breaking point, when the American dream did not yet feel destroyed. It felt updated, faster, and strangely available. A dream that had once worn work boots and carried a lunch pail now sat in a glass conference room, clicked through a slide deck and promised that the future could be monetized before it had even fully arrived. The country leaned toward the screen, the modem connected, the market opened. And millions of people, some cautious, some desperate, some brilliant, some merely hopeful, began to believe that this time the rules really had changed. The promise did not begin on a trading floor. That is important to remember. Before the analysts, before the IPO roadshows, before the television anchors spoke about internet stocks as if they were reading weather reports, the story had a much smaller setting. A garage, a dorm room, a university lab with old carpet and too many cables, a borrowed office near a campus where the furniture did not match and the coffee tasted like it had been sitting for hours. The dot-com dream became a Wall Street event later, but its emotional power came from a place Americans already knew how to love. The idea that someone young, unknown, and underestimated could build something in an ordinary room and change the world. This idea was not invented in the 1990s. It had roots much deeper than the internet. America has always had a soft spot for the maker in a small room. Benjamin Franklin with his experiments, Thomas Edison in Menlo Park, the Wright brothers in a bicycle shop, Hewlett and Packard in a Palo Alto garage in 1939, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak working on early Apple computers in the 1970s in and around the Jobs family home in Los Altos. These stories were told again and again because they made invention feel democratic. They suggested that genius did not need a palace. It did not need inherited wealth or permission from old institutions. It needed tools, stubbornness, timing, and a place where no one important was watching closely enough to stop it. By the 1990s, the garage had become more than a real location. It had become a national symbol. A garage meant independence. A garage meant a company before it became a company. A garage meant the moment before the suits arrived, before the lawyers, before the board meetings, before the stock options were explained in careful language by people who billed by the hour. It was the room where the dream still looked clean. 2 or 3 friends, a rough idea, a machine on a table, and the belief that the old giants were too slow to notice what was coming. The garage made business feel almost innocent. It turned ambition into a kind of craft. That mattered because many Americans were tired of institutions by the time the internet boom began. Large companies had spent the 1980s and early 1990s restructuring, downsizing, and teaching workers a hard lesson about loyalty. A person could give years to a corporation and still be told, politely or not, that the numbers required cuts. Factories closed, middle managers disappeared, benefits changed, pensions became less certain. The old image of a worker spending an entire life at one company was fading, especially for younger people watching their parents navigate layoffs and uncertainty. So when the startup world said, "Come build something new," it was not only offering excitement, it was offering a way out of the disappointment of corporate America. The campus offered another version of the same hope. If the garage was the myth of self-reliance, the campus was the myth of access. A university computer lab in the 1990s could feel like a doorway. Students who did not own much of anything could use machines more powerful than what many families had at home. They could connect to networks, write code, share files, test ideas, and meet others who understood the same strange new language. On the best campuses, especially those tied to engineering, computer science, and research funding, the future seemed to arrive early. Not fully formed, not evenly distributed, but there in pieces: a browser, a server, an email list, a crude website, a message board. A program passed from one person to another because someone wanted to see what it could do. This part of the story is easy to romanticize, but it was real. The internet did not emerge from nowhere. It grew through government research, university networks, defense funding, and decades of technical work by people whose names were mostly unknown outside their fields. ARPANET, funded by the US Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency, had connected research institutions long before most Americans heard the word internet. Later, the National Science Foundation helped expand network access for academic and research use. Protocols, servers, routers, browsers, and standards were built over time, usually not by people trying to become celebrities, but by people solving practical problems. How do computers talk to one another? How do networks remain stable? How do researchers share data? How do you make information easier to find? Then, in the early 1990s, the web made the internet visible to ordinary users in a new way. At the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois, a young programmer named Mark Andreessen and others worked on Mosaic, a browser that helped make the web easier to use. That detail matters. The web did not become powerful only because it existed. It became powerful because it became usable. Ordinary people did not want to memorize commands or move through text-only systems. They wanted to click. They wanted images. They wanted pages. They wanted to feel that they were going somewhere, even if that somewhere was only a document sitting on a server far away. The browser changed the feeling of the internet. It made it less like a tool for specialists and more like a place for everybody else. When Netscape was founded in 1994 by Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen, It carried that feeling into business. Here was a company that seemed to stand between the research internet and the public internet. It did not only sell software, it sold the idea that the web was about to become part of daily life. When Netscape went public in 1995 and the stock soared on its first day, the event became a signal. A young internet company could become valuable before the old economy had even agreed on what it was looking at. On campuses, this signal landed with force. Students saw people close to their own age being treated as pioneers. Professors saw research projects turning into companies. Venture capitalists began circling places where technical talent gathered. Stanford, already closely tied to Silicon Valley, became one of the clearest examples. The relationship between university research, engineering culture, and private money had been developing for decades. But the internet boom gave it a new urgency. A student project could become a company. A search tool could become a business plan. A dorm room directory could become a portal. Yahoo began in 1994 as a directory created by Jerry Yang and David Filo while they were graduate students at Stanford. Google began later in the same university environment when Larry Page and Sergey Brin developed a better way to rank web pages. These stories travelled because they seemed to prove that the campus was not separate from the economy. It was feeding it. That was the promise. The next great company might not come from a boardroom in New York or a factory in Michigan. It might come from a university hallway where someone forgot to clean the whiteboard. It might come from a rented house where the refrigerator was full of takeout boxes and someone had taped network diagrams to the wall. It might come from a place where the people building the future were still wearing sandals to meetings because no one had told them not to. For a young person in that moment, this could feel like a complete reversal of history. Earlier generations had often been told to wait their turn, get the degree, take the entry-level job, learn from older people, move slowly, earn authority over time. The internet boom seemed to weaken that hierarchy. A 24-year-old who understood code could know something that a 55-year-old executive did not. A student could recognize the value of online communities before a media company did. A programmer could build a tool over a weekend that solved a problem a corporation had spent years discussing in committees. Knowledge did not seem to move only downward from senior people to junior people anymore. In some offices, it moved the other way. There was something thrilling and unsettling about that. The young were not simply entering the workplace. They were being told they might redesign it. The old symbols of professionalism looked less certain. The tie, the corner office, the reserved parking space, the formal memo, the long corporate ladder, all of it seemed to belong to a slower world. Startups promised speed. They promised informality. They promised that titles mattered less than contribution, at least in theory. A person who could write the right code or imagine the right product might matter more than someone with 20 years of experience managing departments. In practice, of course, the new world had its own hierarchies. They were just easier to miss at first. The startup culture said anyone could make it, but not everyone had equal access to the rooms where making it was possible. Geography mattered. Being near Silicon Valley mattered. Being near Boston, Seattle, Austin, or certain university networks mattered. Having technical training mattered. Knowing people who could introduce you to investors mattered. Being able to work long hours for uncertain rewards mattered. Being young, healthy, mobile, and free from heavy family obligations mattered. Having parents who could help if everything went wrong mattered. The dream said anyone, but the path was narrower than the slogan suggested. Still, the slogan worked because it contained enough truth to feel fair. Compared to older industries, the internet did lower some barriers. A small team really could build a website. A single programmer could create something useful. Publishing online really was cheaper than printing and distributing a magazine. Selling through a website could be cheaper than opening stores. A new company could reach customers without owning a national chain of buildings. That was not imaginary. The cost of trying had changed. The problem was that many people mistook a lower cost of entry for a guarantee of success. They forgot that opening a door does not mean everyone who walks through it reaches the same room. The garage story hid this tension neatly. It made success look like a matter of courage and talent alone. It left out the supply chains, the universities, the government-funded research, the venture capital firms, the lawyers, the accountants, the recruiters, the landlords, the immigration policies, the tax rules, and the stock market machinery that turned a small company into a fortune for a few. The garage was real in some cases, but it was never the whole story. No company goes public from a garage. It goes public after institutions arrive. It goes public after bankers, investors, and lawyers translate the dream into shares. The campus story had its own omissions. It suggested that intelligence naturally found opportunity, but access to elite technical education was not evenly shared. The students best positioned to join the boom were often already inside powerful systems. They had the right professors, the right labs, the right networks, the right zip codes, the right introductions. Even when they were not wealthy, they were close to machinery that could turn ideas into companies. A student in a community college computer lab might be just as curious, just as gifted, just as hungry. But the distance between curiosity and venture funding was not the same for everyone. And yet it is important not to drain the hope out of this period entirely. People were excited for reasons that make sense. Many had grown up in a world where large institutions seemed permanent. The internet made permanence look weak. Newspapers, bookstores, travel agencies, record stores, banks, universities, television networks, all of them suddenly looked exposed to change. For people who had felt locked out of old systems, that was exhilarating. A small online seller could compete with a larger retailer in ways that had not been possible before. A writer could publish without waiting for an editor. A hobbyist could find an audience. A programmer could distribute software. A job seeker could find listings beyond the local paper. A person in a small town could enter conversations that once belonged to people in major cities. This is one reason the promise spread so widely. It did not sound only like a promise of wealth. It sounded like a promise of recognition. The internet seemed to say that talent hidden in the wrong place might finally be seen. You did not need to be born into the right family. You did not need a factory. You did not need a storefront on a busy street. You did not need a television network to speak. You needed a connection, an idea, and enough skill to build something people wanted. For a country raised on stories of reinvention, this was almost impossible to resist. Inside startups, the work culture fed the feeling. People slept under desks and spoke about it with pride. They ate dinner at the office because going home meant leaving the mission. They accepted chaos as proof that they were moving fast. The mess became part of the identity. Older companies had procedure manuals, startups had urgency. Older companies had departments. Startups had everyone doing everything. Older companies had annual reviews. Startups had the possibility that a person who joined early might become wealthy enough to never need another review again. Stock options were central to this atmosphere. They were not just compensation, they were emotional glue. They allowed companies without deep cash reserves to recruit workers by offering a piece of the future. The worker might accept lower pay, longer hours, and instability, because the options could someday be worth life-changing money. A salary paid the rent. Options carried the dream. The office became a place where exhaustion could be explained as investment. You were not simply working late. You were building equity. You were not merely answering emails at midnight. You were protecting your place in the coming success. This changed how people understood labour. In the older American dream, work was supposed to lead gradually to security. In the dot-com version, work became a wager. You placed your time, your youth, and sometimes your health on the possibility that the company would be acquired or go public before the money ran out. Many employees understood the risk, at least in a general way, but the culture often made caution feel like cowardice. The people around you were excited. The founders spoke confidently. Investors had written checks. Reporters were calling. The office was hiring. The stock market was rising. Each signal reinforced the others until doubt had to push against an entire environment designed to make belief feel rational. The universities, meanwhile, were changing too. Computer science enrollments grew. Business students watched technology firms with new interest. Professors were approached by companies. Research could move quickly into commercialization. A student no longer had to choose cleanly between academic life and business ambition. The border between the two became more porous. In some places, this created genuine innovation. In others, it created impatience. Why finish the degree if the company could start now? Why spend years in graduate school if investors were funding people your age? Why wait for permission from a credentialing system when the market itself seemed ready to vote? Families watched this with mixed feelings. Parents who had taught caution found themselves confused by children who saw caution as outdated. A father who had worked 30 years at a stable company might not know what to make of a son leaving a safe job for a startup with no profits. A mother who had saved carefully might struggle to understand why her daughter was being paid, partly in options instead of cash. At the same time, the stories of sudden success were hard to ignore. If the company went public, the risk could look brilliant. If it failed, it could look irresponsible. During the boom, before the failures piled up, many families saw only the first version. The media helped turn these choices into a cultural script. The young founder became a figure of fascination. The college dropout or graduate student with a startup was treated as a sign that talent had escaped the old ladder. Magazine profiles described messy offices and young teams with a tone that mixed amusement and awe. The lack of polish became part of the charm. A founder who did not dress like a traditional executive was not unprepared. He was authentic. A company without profits was not weak. It was early. A strange business model was not a warning sign. It was disruptive. There was a kind of soft pressure in all this storytelling. It did not order people to take risks. It made risk feel like maturity. To understand the new economy was to accept that old measurements no longer applied. To remain skeptical was to risk becoming the person who laughed at the telephone, the automobile, the airplane, the personal computer, every great change before it became obvious. Nobody wanted to be that person. Nobody wanted to be the one who failed to recognize history while it was still cheap to buy. This is one of the cruel mechanisms of a bubble. It uses the fear of missing out, but also the fear of being small-minded. It tells people that skepticism is not intelligence. It is a failure of imagination. It does not simply say you might get rich. It says you might be part of progress. That is a much stronger temptation. Most people do not want only money. They want their choices to mean something. They want to believe they saw clearly when others did not. They want to tell a story later in which they were brave before the crowd arrived. By the end of the 1990s, the garage and the campus had become recruitment tools for an entire economy of belief. Entrepreneurs used them to explain why they should be trusted. Investors used them to justify funding unproven companies. Workers used them to explain long hours and unstable pay. Ordinary investors used them to believe that buying technology stocks was not speculation, but participation in a new national beginning. The stories were comforting because they made the future feel open. They said that the next great fortune might not belong to the old families, the old corporations, or the old cities. It might belong to whoever understood the web first. But there was another side to that openness. When everyone is told they can make it, failure becomes harder to explain. If the system is truly open, then those who do not win must have missed something. They were too slow, too cautious, too attached to old rules. This is where the promise begins to turn. The language of opportunity can inspire people, but it can also hide risk by making risk feel like a test of character. If you believe hard enough, work long enough, join early enough, move fast enough, maybe you deserve the reward. If the company collapses, if your options become worthless, if your savings shrink, if the job disappears, the culture rarely apologizes. It moves on to the next promise. For now, though, we are still before the collapse. The lights in the offices are still on. The campus labs are still full. The garage doors are still open in the national imagination. Young companies are still being named as if a playful name might make them memorable enough to survive. Recruiters are still calling. Venture capital money is still moving. Newspapers are still writing about 20-somethings who seem to have skipped the hard middle years of adulthood and gone directly to wealth. Parents are still trying to understand. Workers are still calculating what their options might be worth. Students are still wondering whether the future is waiting in a classroom, a startup, or a half-formed idea they have not yet told anyone about. The American dream had always carried a promise that birth did not have to decide destiny. In the dot-com years, that promise was placed onto the internet with extraordinary force. The web seemed to offer a new frontier without land, a gold rush without mountains, a factory without walls. It seemed to say that the gatekeepers had lost control, and for a little while, that sounded true enough to build lives around. But dreams that expand quickly need money to keep expanding. They need investors willing to believe before evidence arrives. They need bankers willing to sell the story to the public. They need a market hungry enough to treat a website as if it were already an empire. And that is where the next part of the story begins. Not in the garage anymore, and not in the lab, but in the place where American hope has so often been measured, packaged, priced, and sold to strangers. By the time Wall Street arrived in full, the internet had already gathered its stories. The grudge had given it charm. The campus had given it credibility. Young engineers had given it speed. Early users had given it a sense of discovery. But none of that was enough to turn a website into a national obsession. For that, the internet needed bankers, analysts, brokers, television screens, pension money, retirement accounts, and the strange machinery that can take a young company with uncertain prospects and make it feel, at least for a season, like the safest dangerous thing in America. The first thing to understand is that Wall Street did not fall in love with the internet all at once. It flirted first. It watched from a distance, curious but not fully committed. The early web looked exciting, but it also looked messy. Many companies were small. Their revenues were thin. Their offices were improvised. Their leaders were young and often spoke in a language that made traditional investors uncomfortable. They talked about users instead of customers, communities instead of markets, traffic instead of earnings. A person trained to read balance sheets could look at many of these companies and see very little that justified their prices. But markets are not moved only by balance sheets. They are moved by stories, and the internet offered Wall Street one of the most profitable stories it had encountered in decades. The story was simple enough for anyone to understand. A new medium had arrived. It would change how people shopped, read, worked, booked travel, listened to music, found jobs, managed money, talked to friends, and learned about the world. The companies that captured those habits early would become the next great corporations. The opportunity was enormous. The risk of missing it was even larger. That last part mattered most. Wall Street does not only chase certainty, it chases fees, volume, momentum, and the fear that someone else will capture the business first. Once investment banks realised that internet companies could be taken public, that investors would buy them, and that the fees could be substantial, the courtship turned serious. An initial public offering had always been one of the great rituals of American capitalism. A private company, after years of growth, would sell shares to the public. Investment banks would help set the price, arrange buyers, prepare documents, and present the company to institutions. There was ceremony in it. A company had to be ready, or at least ready enough to survive the attention. It had to explain its history, its finances, its risks, its plans. Investors were supposed to judge the business and decide what it was worth. That was the formal version. The dot-com years did not abolish that ritual. They changed the mood around it. Going public became less like reaching maturity, and more like stepping onto a launch pad. Netscape's public offering in 1995 showed what was possible. The company was young, its future uncertain, and yet the demand for its shares was enormous. The stock price surged on the first day. The lesson was not subtle. If a company could plausibly attach itself to the future of the web, the market might reward it before the company had proved much in the present. That lesson spread quickly through Silicon Valley, through venture capital firms, through investment banks, and eventually through the living rooms of ordinary investors. It suggested that the public market could be used not merely to reward success, but to finance the race toward it. After Netscape, the pace changed. Yahoo went public in 1996. Amazon followed in 1997. eBay went public in 1998. Each company had its own business, its own strengths, its own problems, and its own future. They should not all be treated as jokes or symbols of foolishness. Some of them were building real platforms with real user devotion and real long-term value. That was part of what made the entire moment so convincing. There were genuine companies in the middle of the frenzy. The presence of real winners made it easier for investors to believe that almost any internet company might be one of them. If one online bookstore could become something larger, why not an online pet store? If one web directory could become a major portal, why not dozens of portals? If auctions could move online, why not groceries, furniture, toys, banking, education, insurance, and every other piece of daily life? Wall Street began to package this belief in a form the public could buy. Analysts wrote reports explaining why old valuation methods did not fully apply. Television guests spoke of network effects, first mover advantage, market share, and the importance of capturing users before competitors did. New measurements entered the conversation. Page views, unique visitors, click-through rates, eyeballs, stickiness, burn rate, customer acquisition cost. These terms were not meaningless. Some described real business problems, but during the bubble, they often became substitutes for harder questions. Did the company make money? Could it make money? Would customers stay if discounts disappeared? Was the cost of growth so high that growth itself became dangerous? The answer was often unclear, and unclear answers are easier to sell in a rising market. A profitable company can be measured. A dream can be expanded. When a business is already mature, its value is tied to what it earns. When a business is presented as the beginning of a vast new category, its value can float on assumptions. If the internet would transform everything, then almost any large number could be defended by imagining a large enough future. This was the strange arithmetic of the era. Losses could be explained as investment. Heavy spending could be described as land grabbing. A company that sold $1 worth of goods for less than $1 could still be praised if it was adding customers quickly enough. The market was not rewarding what the company was. It was rewarding what the company might become if many things went right and very few things went wrong. There is a room we should spend a moment inside. It is not a garage now. It is a conference room in an investment bank. The table is polished. There are pitchers of water, thick documents, legal pads, and people in suits listening to a founder explain the internet with the confidence of someone who has explained it many times in the last week. A banker asks about revenue growth. Another asks about competitors. Someone asks when the company expects to become profitable, and the answer moves quickly towards scale, brand, users, and the size of the total addressable market. The language is smooth because it has been practiced. Around that table, the company is being translated. What began as code and ambition has to become a financial product. It has to become something a pension fund, mutual fund, or wealthy client can buy. It has to become a story that can survive a roadshow. The roadshow was one of the quiet theatres of the bubble. Executives travelled from city to city, presenting their companies to institutional investors. They had slides, they had charts, they had growth curves that tilted upward with a confidence that made the future look almost mechanical. The purpose was not merely to explain, it was to create demand. Demand would help set the offering price. Demand would create scarcity. Scarcity would help produce the first day pop that made headlines and confirm the excitement. A hot IPO was not just a financing event, it was advertising. When a stock doubled on its first day, the company gained attention. It could never have bought through ordinary marketing. The market itself became part of the brand. This was where Wall Street's love of the website became practical. Investment banks earned fees by taking companies public. Analysts gained influence by covering the companies investors wanted to hear about. Brokers could offer access to hot offerings to favoured clients. Venture capitalists needed exits for the companies they had funded. Founders and early employees wanted liquidity, or at least the possibility of it. The system had many participants, each able to tell themselves they were serving progress, and each able to benefit if the excitement continued. Nobody had to be a villain for the incentives to become dangerous. The machine rewarded belief and punished hesitation. The conflicts were not always obvious to ordinary people watching from home. A television analyst recommending a stock could sound like an independent expert. A research report could look like careful study. A banker's enthusiasm could sound like conviction. But the late 1990s exposed a problem that had been growing inside the financial world. The investment banks that helped companies go public often employed analysts who covered those same companies. A positive report could support investor demand. Strong investor demand could help the banking relationship. Banking relationships generated fees. The line between analysis and sales did not disappear, but it became harder for the public to see clearly. Some of the star analysts of the era became famous in ways analysts had rarely been famous before. Mary Meeker at Morgan Stanley became known for her internet research. Henry Blodgett became widely associated with bold calls on Amazon and other internet names. Investors listened to these figures because they seemed to understand a world that was moving too quickly for traditional measures. Their reports were read not only for numbers but for permission. Permission to believe, permission to hold, permission to buy at prices that would have looked absurd in another industry. A confident analyst could turn uncertainty into a plan. The culture around investing changed at the same time. Online brokerages made trading easier for ordinary people. E-Trade, Ameritrade, and other platforms gave individuals the ability to buy and sell stocks from home with a speed and convenience that earlier generations did not have. The image of the investor shifted. You did not need to call a broker in a formal office. You could sit at a desk in your spare room, log in and make decisions yourself. This felt empowering. It also made the market feel closer, more immediate and more personal. A stock price was no longer something printed in tomorrow's newspaper. It was moving in front of you. That immediacy changed behaviour. People checked their accounts during the workday. They talked about stocks in offices, at dinner parties, at family gatherings, on message boards. Financial chat rooms and online forums created communities where enthusiasm could feed on itself. A rumour, a price target, a new partnership, a vague announcement, all of it could travel quickly. People who had never studied a company's financial statements could feel informed because they were surrounded by constant information. There is a difference between information and understanding, but during a boom the difference becomes easy to ignore. The person with the newest ticker symbol can sound wiser than the person asking the oldest questions. Inside many households, the stock market moved from the background to the foreground. The daily rise of technology shares made people feel that wealth was being created almost visibly. Retirement accounts grew. Mutual funds advertised strong returns. A neighbour's success became evidence. A co-worker's gains became pressure. If your own account was rising, you felt rewarded for participating. If you stayed out, you felt left behind by people who might not be smarter than you, only less cautious. The American dream had always included comparison, but the dot-com market sharpened it. It let people measure themselves against one another in real time. Wall Street understood this appetite and fed it. Financial media expanded. Market news became entertainment. The trading day had a rhythm and a cast of characters. The opening bell, the midday update, the closing numbers, the after-hours chatter. The Nasdaq was not merely an index. It became a mood indicator. When it rose, the future felt bright. When it dipped, commentators explained why the long-term story remained intact. Every recovery from a small sell-off seemed to prove that doubt was temporary. The market taught people to buy the dip before the phrase became common in later years. Skepticism looked foolish each time prices resumed climbing. One of the most dangerous effects of a long rise is that it trains memory to forget pain. If a stock falls and then rises higher, the fall becomes not a warning but an opportunity. If analysts are too cautious and prices keep climbing, caution becomes embarrassing. If a company misses traditional expectations but gains users, the market may forgive it. Over time, people learn which arguments make money. In the dot-com years, the arguments that made money were the arguments of expansion. Bigger markets, faster adoption, earlier entry, winner-take-all outcomes. The internet would not produce many modest companies, the story suggested. It would produce category winners, and those winners would be enormous. The task was to find them before everyone else did. The phrase winner-take-all did a lot of work in that period. It encouraged investors to tolerate losses because the eventual prize was imagined as vast. If one company became the dominant online bookseller, or the dominant portal, or the dominant auction site, or the dominant service in some new category, then early losses could be justified as the cost of capturing the prize. This was not always wrong. Some internet markets really did reward scale. Network effects could be powerful. A marketplace with more buyers attracted more sellers, and more sellers attracted more buyers. A search engine that improved with use could become harder to displace. A platform with many users could gain advantages over smaller rivals. But the market began applying this logic everywhere, even where it made little sense. Not every business becomes a natural monopoly just because it has a website. That did not stop companies from presenting themselves as inevitable. The word portal became especially important. In the 1990s, before search engines became as dominant as they later would, portals were imagined as gateways to the internet. Yahoo, Excite, Lycos, AltaVista, and others competed to become the starting point for users. A portal could offer search, news, email, weather, stock quotes, shopping links, and directories. If millions of people began their online lives there each day, advertisers would pay. Partnerships would follow. The portal would control attention. Attention would become revenue. Revenue would become dominance. Dominance would become profit. The chain sounded logical enough as long as one did not ask too sharply, when each step would arrive. Advertising became another pillar of the dream. Websites promised that online ads would be more measurable than print or television. You could count impressions. You could track clicks. You could know whether a user responded. This seemed revolutionary, and in many ways it was, but the enthusiasm ran ahead of the actual economics. Banner ads were sold with great confidence. Companies spent heavily to attract visitors, and then hoped advertising would support the business. The trouble was that attention is not the same as income. A website could attract visitors who had no intention of buying anything. It could create traffic at high cost and sell advertising at rates that depended on the belief that traffic itself was precious. If the belief weakened, the model became fragile. Still, during the boom, fragility was often hidden by fresh capital. When losses grew, companies could raise more money. When spending increased, they could frame it as expansion. When competitors appeared, they could spend even more to defend their position. Venture capital funded the early losses, then public markets funded the later ones. Wall Street helped move the companies from private speculation to public participation. This was the point at which risk migrated. Early investors and insiders often had the chance to sell shares after lock-up periods expired. Public investors, including mutual funds and individuals, bought into companies whose futures were still deeply uncertain. The dream became widely owned just as the danger increased. There is another ordinary room worth noticing, a small office in a local brokerage branch somewhere far from Silicon Valley. A retired couple sits across from a financial advisor. They are not trying to become rich in a wild way. They are trying not to fall behind. Their savings represent decades of work. The advisor discusses growth funds, technology exposure, long-term opportunity. The couple has heard about the internet from their grandchildren. They have seen the market rise on the evening news. They do not understand every company in the fund, but they understand that their old certificates of deposit are not growing like the market. They understand that retirement is expensive. They understand that everyone says the world is changing. A small adjustment feels reasonable, then another, then a larger one. In a boom, risk rarely enters a household wearing a warning sign. It enters as a sensible update. This was how Wall Street's love affair with websites reached people who had never visited the offices where those websites were built. It came through mutual funds, retirement plans, brokerage accounts, newspaper columns, television shows, and casual conversations. It came through the repeated idea that technology was not a sector, but the engine of the entire economy. If that was true, then avoiding technology stocks could be made to feel irresponsible. Diversification began to bend under the weight of recent performance. Funds that owned more technology did better, so investors bought them, which pushed more money toward technology, which supported higher prices, which made the funds look even smarter. The circle tightened. A website in this environment became more than a business address. It became proof that a company belonged to the future. Old companies rushed to explain their internet strategies. New companies emphasized the .com identity as loudly as possible. Adding .com to a name could change how investors perceived it. Domains themselves became valuable objects of speculation. There was a sense that land had been discovered, but the land consisted of words typed into a browser bar. Owning the right name, the right category, the right first impression seemed like owning a corner lot in a city that had not yet been built. Wall Street was very good at turning that feeling into transactions. It could take possibility and give it a ticker symbol. It could take fear of missing out and give it a buy rating. It could take a founder's confidence and place it into a prospectus. It could take a website that had never earned $1 of profit and present it as a claim on the next stage of civilization. That sounds harsh, but it is also what financial markets often do at their most ambitious. They price the future before the future has arrived. The problem is not that markets imagine. The problem is that they can begin to confuse imagination with evidence. By 1999, the romance had become difficult to interrupt. A company going public could see its shares soar on the first day, making instant fortunes for early holders and creating headlines that drew more companies toward the same path. Entrepreneurs watched other entrepreneurs become wealthy and learned the lesson. Venture capitalists watched public investors reward speed and learned the lesson. Investment banks watched fees accumulate and learned the lesson. Retail investors watched stocks rise after offerings and learned the lesson. Everyone was teaching everyone else to keep going. The American dream, under these conditions, began to look less like ownership of a home, and more like ownership of the right shares before the crowd arrived. A home still mattered. A steady job still mattered. Education still mattered. But the emotional centre of upward mobility shifted. The fastest path to security was no longer imagined as decades of work. It was imagined as equity. Equity in a startup. Equity in a public company. Equity in a fund that owned the future. Equity was the word that made speculation sound responsible, and employment sound entrepreneurial. You were not just an employee. You had upside. You were not just an investor. You were participating in transformation. For workers inside .com companies, this changed daily life in ways that were easy to miss from the outside. A rising valuation could make a miserable week feel worthwhile. A rumour of acquisition could lift morale faster than any manager could. A successful funding round could make people tolerate chaos. The office was full of invisible numbers, the strike price of options, the possible IPO price, the imagined value after a first-day pop. People did the math privately. They calculated houses, student loans, early retirement, parents' mortgages, freedom from ordinary work. A person could still be eating cold pizza at midnight under bad lighting, but in his head he might already be choosing the neighbourhood where he would buy a home. This was not greed in the simple sense. it was hope under pressure. Many workers were responding to an economy that had made stability feel less guaranteed. If a company no longer promised lifelong security, then perhaps a startup could promise a chance at escape. If wages rose slowly, maybe options could leap. If housing in technology regions became expensive, maybe the only way to buy was to join the kind of company whose stock could outrun the market. The bubble fed on ambition, but it also fed on anxiety. People were not only chasing luxury, they were trying to secure a place in a country where security itself seemed to be moving farther away. Wall Street did not create all of this, but it amplified it. It gave the dream liquidity. It gave it daily prices. It allowed private hope to become public spectacle. The stock market turned belief into numbers that could be watched, refreshed, celebrated, and feared. A website that yesterday was known mainly to its users could become a symbol on CNBC. A founder could become a public figure. A company could become valuable enough to use its own inflated stock as currency to buy other companies. High prices created power, and that power created more confidence, at least while the prices held. A few cautious voices warned that the numbers did not make sense. Some investors argued that profits still mattered. Some journalists questioned the business models. Some older executives shook their heads at companies spending fortunes on advertising without a clear path to earnings. But warnings during a boom have a special weakness. They can be right too early. If you warned in 1997 and the market kept rising through 1998 and 1999, people stopped hearing the warning. They heard only the missed gains. A skeptic who is early looks wrong until the moment he's suddenly described as prophetic. Most people cannot live on being early to the truth if everyone around them is getting rich from the lie. So the love affair continued. Websites became offerings. Offerings became headlines. Headlines became demand. Demand became higher prices. Higher prices became proof. The system began to feed on its own reflection. Every successful IPO made the next one easier to sell. Every analyst upgrade gave nervous investors another reason to hold. Every story of a young millionaire made another worker wonder whether leaving a safe job was not reckless but necessary. Every rising account balance made ordinary households more willing to believe that the future had finally become investable. Then the numbers grew so large that they began to change the people who held them. A worker with options worth thousands on paper might work hard. A worker with options worth millions on paper might begin to see life differently. A founder whose company had never made a profit but was valued above long-established firms might begin to believe the valuation said something permanent about his own judgment. An investor whose account doubled might mistake timing for intelligence. A country watching all of this might begin to treat paper wealth as if it had already been earned, taxed, saved, and safely placed in the bank. That is where the next part of the story waits, in the strange emotional territory between being rich and merely being priced as rich. The late 1990s created people who could look at a screen and see a fortune, but could not always spend it, protect it, or even fully understand how quickly it could vanish. They were paper millionaires, and for a brief moment there were more of them than America knew what to do with. There is a specific kind of wealth that exists before it becomes money. It appears on a statement. It appears in an account balance. It appears in a calculation someone does late at night after everyone else has gone to bed. It can change how a person walks into work the next morning, how carefully they look at houses they cannot yet buy, how long they are willing to stay at a job that is consuming them, and how much risk they are willing to tolerate because the number is right there, visible, printed, glowing, almost real. During the dot-com boom, America filled with this kind of wealth. Not cash in the bank, not paid-off homes, not savings that could survive a hard year. Paper wealth, option wealth. Market wealth. Wealth that made people feel as if they had arrived before they had actually been allowed inside. This is one of the most important emotional facts of the late 1990s. The boom created fortunes faster than many people could understand them. but it also created a strange delay between being told you were rich and being able to live securely as a rich person. A founder whose company had gone public could open a newspaper and see a valuation that made him look like a genius. An employee who had joined early could calculate what her options might be worth if the stock held. A regular investor could look at a retirement account and see years of future comforts suddenly added by a rising market. The numbers were not imaginary in the simple sense. They were attached to real shares, real companies, real trading prices. But they were fragile, and fragility is easy to ignore when every week seems to confirm the dream. To understand the paper millionaire, we have to understand the stock option. It was one of the central objects of the dot-com workplace, as important in its own way as the laptop, the whiteboard, or the company-branded fleece vest. A stock option gave an employee the right to buy company shares later at a set price, usually called the strike price. If the company's stock eventually traded far above that price, the employee could exercise the options and make the difference. In plain language, options were a way of saying, help us build this company now, accept the uncertainty now, and if we become valuable later, you will share in the upside. They made risk feel communal. They made sacrifice feel rational. They made a low salary or punishing workload easier to accept because somewhere beyond the exhaustion, there might be a number large enough to explain everything. In a young company, especially one that did not yet have the money to pay high salaries, this was powerful. A startup could look at a talented engineer, designer, salesperson, or operations manager and say, we cannot pay what a large company can pay, but a large company cannot offer you this kind of future. The future was the product. The future was the recruiting pitch. A candidate might sit in a cramped interview room while a founder sketched out the market on a whiteboard. The founder would talk about scale, first mover advantage, user growth, and the possibility of an IPO. At some point, the conversation would turn to options. Not money today, money later, not certainty, possibility. And possibility, in a country trained to admire risk, can feel almost like a moral invitation. There was something deeply American about it. The option seemed to turn the employee into a partial owner, and ownership had always sat near the centre of the American dream. Own land, own a home, own a small business, own a piece of your future. In the dot-com years, that idea shifted from soil and houses to shares and vesting schedules. A young worker might not own property. She might not have much savings. She might be sharing an apartment with 2 roommates because rent near the technology corridors had become absurd. But she had options. On paper, she had a claim on the future. That claim could feel like a substitute for everything she did not yet have. The details were less simple. Options usually vested over time, often over 4 years. You did not receive the whole reward on the first day. You earned the right gradually by staying. This kept workers tied to the company. Leave too soon, and you left money behind. Stay long enough, and the next vesting date might make the hardship worthwhile. The calendar became psychological. 1 more quarter, 1 more product launch, 1 more funding round, 1 more year until the options vest. The promise did not need to pay immediately to shape behaviour. It only needed to remain close enough to keep people from walking away. Then there were lock-up periods after a company went public. Early employees and insiders were often restricted from selling shares for a period, commonly around 6 months. This meant a person could watch a stock soar and still be unable to turn that rising price into cash. The market might say you were rich, but the rules could say not yet. Imagine that feeling. You work for years at a company that almost falls apart more than once. It finally goes public. The stock opens high, then rises even higher. Friends call you a millionaire. Your parents ask if you're going to buy a house. Co-workers talk about cars, vacations, and paying off student loans. But you cannot sell. You can only watch. Every morning the price changes, and with it the life you think you might soon be able to live. That waiting period produced a very particular kind of anxiety. Rising prices made people euphoric, but they also made them protective. Falling prices could ruin a day before it began. A worker might check the stock before brushing his teeth. Someone might refresh a quote during lunch and feel his mood move with the number. In earlier generations, a worker's income was often tied to hours, wages, commissions, or a salary. During the dot-com boom, many workers felt their entire future tied to market sentiment. The company's product mattered, but so did the mood of investors who had never set foot in the office. A rumour, an analyst's note, a competitor's announcement, or a weak trading day could change the paper value of years of labour in minutes. This was not only happening to founders and engineers. Receptionists, office managers, customer support workers, recruiters, and early administrative employees could also hold options. That was part of what made the boom feel democratic. A person who answered phones at the right company early enough might appear, briefly, to have made one of the great career decisions of her life. The phrase paper millionaire entered ordinary conversation because it described people who did not necessarily look rich, dress rich, or live rich, but who held shares that the market valued at more than $1 million. Some were still driving old cars, some were still renting, some were still eating takeout at their desks. But inside their financial lives, at least on paper, something enormous had happened. The country loved these stories. They were easier to tell than the difficult ones. A secretary at a technology company becomes rich. A programmer in his 20s can retire. A founder who once slept under a desk is now worth more than executives twice his age. These stories had the structure of fairy tales, but they were reported as business news. They suggested that the economy had become more open, that wealth could come not only through inheritance, credentials, or corporate seniority, but through timing and courage. They were shared in newspapers, magazines, television segments, and office gossip because they made people feel the future might be generous after all. But the phrase paper millionaire contained its own warning. Paper can burn, paper can tear, paper can be misplaced. Paper can lose meaning when the institution behind it loses trust. The wealth of the dot-com years depended heavily on market prices staying high. If a stock fell before employees could sell, the fortune shrank. If it fell below the strike price, options could become worthless. If someone exercised options at a high valuation and the stock later collapsed, there could be tax consequences that outlived the wealth itself. Some workers learned this painfully, when they owed taxes based on gains that had existed only briefly on paper. The dream did not always vanish cleanly. Sometimes it left bills behind. During the boom, though, those dangers were often treated as technical details. The main story remained upward movement. The Nasdaq kept climbing. Venture capital money kept flowing. IPOs kept making headlines. A rising stock market created what economists call the wealth effect, a tendency for people to spend more when they feel richer, even if that wealth is tied to assets rather than income. In the late 1990s, this was visible in ordinary ways. People upgraded homes, bought cars, dined out, invested in home offices, paid for private schools, took vacations, or simply became more comfortable carrying debt because their portfolios looked strong. The future seemed funded. In parts of California, especially around Silicon Valley, the paper wealth spilled into housing. This is one of the clearest places where the dream met the ground. A technology worker might have options worth a fortune, but buying a house still required cash, credit, timing, and confidence that the fortune would remain. Home prices climbed as money from the boom moved into real estate. Sellers knew that technology workers might be flush with stock gains. Buyers stretched because they feared being priced out forever. The old American dream of owning a home did not disappear. It became tangled with the new dream of equity wealth. You could use stock gains to buy a house, or you could watch houses rise beyond reach while waiting for your options to vest. Either way, the market had entered the kitchen table. For those outside the boom regions, the picture was different but connected. Many Americans were not becoming paper millionaires. They were watching others become paper millionaires. That distinction mattered. The United States in the late 1990s was often described as prosperous, and in many ways it was. The economy was strong. Jobs were being created. Technology productivity was widely discussed. But prosperity did not feel the same everywhere. A worker in a manufacturing town did not experience the internet boom the same way a software engineer in Palo Alto did. A retail worker in Ohio did not receive stock options because Yahoo's share price rose. A teacher with a modest retirement account might benefit from mutual fund gains, but not enough to join the world being profiled in magazines. This is why the title of Paper Millionaire tells only half the truth. The other half is the country still waiting to be rich. Many families were still waiting for the promise of the 1990s to reach their paychecks, their neighbourhoods, their debts, their medical bills, their college savings. They heard that America was in a new economy, but the rent was due in the old economy. They heard that technology had changed everything, but their wages had not changed enough. They heard that the internet was creating fortunes, but the main way they touched those fortunes was through a retirement account they were afraid to mismanage. The boom widened the space between seeing wealth and having security. That difference between wealth and security is essential. Wealth can be a number. Security is a condition. Wealth can rise during trading hours. Security is what lets a person sleep when the market is closed. In the dot-com years, many people gained wealth without gaining security. Their accounts rose, but their jobs were not guaranteed. Their options vested, but their company was not profitable. Their home value increased, but so did the cost of living. Their retirement fund grew, but it was more exposed to market swings than they fully understood. America looked richer, but much of that richness was balanced on expectations. Expectations are powerful because they change behavior before reality catches up. A company valued highly can hire more people, lease more office space, spend more on advertising, and acquire competitors using its own stock. Employees at that company can make personal plans based on the rising value of their options. Local businesses near the company can expand because workers are spending. Landlords can raise rents because demand is strong. Banks can lend with more confidence because assets appear to be rising. In this way, paper wealth does not stay on paper. It moves through real life. It changes prices, choices, and obligations. Then, if the paper wealth disappears, the real-life commitments remain. This was one of the quiet dangers of the boom. People made permanent decisions based on temporary prices. A worker bought a home assuming the stock would hold. A family increased spending assuming the portfolio would recover from any dip. A startup leased office space assuming the next funding round would arrive. A city planned around technology growth. A young person left school or a stable job because the opportunity seemed too urgent to miss. None of these decisions was necessarily foolish in isolation. They were made inside an environment where everyone else appeared to be adjusting to the same future. When enough people act on the same assumption, the assumption begins to feel like fact. At the top of the boom, the difference between a millionaire and a paper millionaire could be hard to see from the outside. The restaurants were full, the cars improved. Real estate agents took calls from young buyers who would have seemed impossible clients a few years earlier. Luxury goods found customers who had not inherited wealth and did not yet have the habits of people raised around it. Some new money was spent loudly because it was new. Some was spent nervously because the people holding it knew, somewhere under the excitement, that the number could change. There were parties, but there were also quiet calculations. There were people who sold in time and people who waited because selling felt like a betrayal of the larger dream. If the company was going to become the next great American institution, why sell early? Company culture often encouraged holding. Founders wanted employees committed. Analysts spoke of long-term growth. Co-workers who sold too much could be judged as lacking faith. In some startups, belief became a social expectation. The stock price was not only a financial measure, it was a measure of loyalty, intelligence, and shared destiny. People who raise concerns about valuation or spending risked being seen as negative. In a normal company, skepticism might be a useful management tool. In a bubble company, skepticism could feel like a threat to morale. There is something very human in this. People do not only want to make money, they want their suffering to have meaning. The long nights, the missed dinners, the stress, the unstable plans, the relationships strained by work, all of it became easier to bear if the company's value proved that the sacrifice mattered. A falling stock price did not merely reduce wealth. It threatened the story people had told themselves about why they had given so much. That is why paper wealth can be emotionally heavier than cash. Cash is cash. Paper wealth is a promise about who you are becoming. For ordinary investors, the same pattern appeared in a quieter form. A retirement account rising in the late 1990s could make people feel that their discipline had been rewarded. They had worked, they had saved, they had invested. The market had done the rest. It was satisfying, especially for people who had watched older forms of security weaken. But many did not realize how concentrated their hope had become. Technology stocks occupied larger and larger portions of major indexes and mutual funds. A person who thought he owned the American economy might own more of the internet dream than he understood. When the strongest part of the market keeps rising, it naturally becomes a larger part of the portfolio. Success creates concentration unless someone deliberately resists it. Resisting was difficult. Conservative choices looked dull. Cash looked lazy. Bonds looked timid. Value investors looked old. The language of the time made patience sound like misunderstanding. Even people who did not buy individual internet stocks could feel the pressure through funds, workplace retirement plans, and the general atmosphere. If your neighbour's account was rising faster than yours, if a magazine said the new economy had changed valuation, if your financial advisor suggested more growth exposure, if your own cautious choices made you feel left behind, the market had already entered your mind. It did not need to force you. It only needed to make you question whether prudence was actually fear. The deeper problem was that the American dream had always relied on a belief in effort, but the dot-com boom rewarded timing so visibly that effort began to look incomplete. A teacher could work hard for 30 years and never see the kind of wealth an early employee might see after 18 months at the right company. A machinist could master a trade and still watch a 26-year-old founder with no profits become worth hundreds of millions. A nurse could save carefully and feel poor beside a neighbour whose internet fund had doubled. This did not mean the founder had done nothing or the employee had not worked hard. Many worked intensely. But the scale of reward was no longer tied to labour in a way that felt familiar. It was tied to market position. That shift did damage even before the crash. It changed how people understood fairness. If wealth could appear so quickly for some, why was security still so difficult for others? If the economy was booming, why were so many still anxious? If technology was making the country richer, why did ordinary life still require so much debt, commuting, overtime, and careful budgeting? The answer was complicated, but the feeling was clear. America was watching a new class of winners rise in public, while millions of families remained one illness, one layoff, or one market reversal away from trouble. The boom did not invent that insecurity. It made it harder to ignore. This is where the paper millionaire becomes a symbol, not only of excess, but of misunderstanding. The late 1990s taught people to mistake valuation for value, liquidity for security, options for ownership, and participation in a market for control over one's life. It taught workers that risk could be empowering while quietly shifting more risk onto them. It taught investors that future growth could justify present danger. It taught households that rising accounts might solve problems that wages could not. Some people benefited enormously, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But many others were left holding a feeling rather than a fortune. The feeling was powerful enough to keep the machinery moving. Paper millionaires became proof that the system worked. Their stories attracted more workers, more investors, more companies, more spending, more belief. They appeared in conversation like modern folk heroes. Someone knew someone who had joined early. Someone had a cousin whose options were worth millions. Someone had heard about an office manager who retired before 40. These stories did not need to be common to be influential. They only needed to be possible. Possibility is often enough to rearrange a life. Inside the boom, the country was not only trying to get rich, it was trying to believe that the path to richness had become more open than before. That belief softened the unease of a changing economy. It made instability feel like opportunity. It made market dependence feel like independence. It made people accept that the safest route might be the riskiest one, because the old safe routes no longer seemed to reach far enough. In that way, the dot-com bubble did not simply decorate the American dream with technology. It altered the dream's basic instructions. Do not wait. Do not save slowly. Do not ask too many old questions. Find the next thing before others see it. Get equity. Hold on. Trust the curve. And around this belief, companies were spending at a pace that made the paper fortunes feel justified. If the stock price said the future was enormous, then the company had to behave as if the future were enormous. It had to advertise, hire, expand, and dominate before anyone else did. It had to turn attention into inevitability. It had to show the public that it belonged in the national imagination, even if the business underneath was still uncertain. That is how a sock puppet could become a symbol of an era, how a company selling pet food online could purchase some of the most expensive advertising space in America, and how the logic of infinite growth moved from analyst reports into living rooms during the most watched television event of the year. The sock puppet did not look like a warning. That is part of why it worked so well. It was not a banker in a suit explaining valuations, not a founder standing in front of a chart, not an analyst using words that made ordinary people feel as if they had walked into the middle of a private conversation. It was a little dog puppet with a microphone, a funny voice, and a face that seemed made for television. It joked, it sang, it appeared in interviews. It became more recognizable than many of the executives trying to explain the new economy. And for a short time, that puppet carried one of the clearest messages of the dot-com years into American living rooms. The internet was not only for programmers, investors, or people in California. It was coming for the ordinary errands of ordinary life, even buying food for the dog. Pets.com was not the largest company of the bubble, and it was not the only company to fail. It was not even the most financially destructive example if measured in dollars alone. But symbols do not become symbols because they are the biggest. They become symbols because they reveal something. Pets.com revealed the mood of the period in a form almost anyone could understand. A company selling pet supplies online spent heavily to become famous before it had proved that the business could work. It bought attention. It bought advertising. It bought a place in the national conversation. It went public near the top of the bubble, and before the year was over, it was finished. That speed is why people remember it. The rise and fall was so compressed that the whole dot-com story seemed to fit inside it like a lesson no one wanted while the lesson was still happening. To be fair, the idea behind Pets.com was not absurd on its face. That is worth saying clearly. Americans spent money on pets. They bought food, toys, litter, beds, medicine, collars, treats, and all the small items that turn an animal into part of a household. Pet ownership was already a large market. People already had to make repeated purchases. Heavy bags of dog food and cat litter were inconvenient to carry home. A website that let customers order pet supplies from home had a logic to it. In a later world, online pet supply businesses would become normal. The problem was not that Americans would never buy pet supplies online. The problem was timing, economics, logistics, and the belief that growth could solve almost every other weakness if only it arrived fast enough. That belief sat at the centre of the bubble. Growth first, profit later, customers first, margins later, brand first, discipline later. The logic was repeated so often that it began to sound less like a strategy and more like common sense. If the internet was going to produce dominant winners, then the company that reached the customer first might own the relationship. If owning the relationship mattered most, then spending heavily to acquire customers could be defended. If losses came from building the brand, expanding infrastructure, discounting products, and capturing market share, then losses could be described as temporary. The company was not failing to make money. It was investing in becoming unavoidable. That word, unavoidable, explains a great deal. .com companies did not simply want customers. They wanted to become habits. They wanted to be the first place people thought of when they needed a book, a toy, a flight, a loan, a job listing, a grocery order, a birthday gift, or a bag of pet food. The web was still young enough that many habits had not yet hardened. People had not fully decided where they would shop online, which sites they trusted, which brands belonged to the future, and which ones were simply experiments. This made the late 1990s feel like a land rush. The customers were out there, the categories were open. The company that planted its flag early might become the default. The land rush comparison was used often, and it was useful, but it could also mislead. Land stays where it is. A customer does not. A customer can be expensive to attract and easy to lose. During the .com boom, many companies behaved as if customers acquired through discounts and advertising would remain loyal. Once the discounts faded and the advertising slowed, sometimes they did, often they did not. A person might order from a website because shipping was free, the price was low, and a promotion made the first purchase attractive. That did not mean the person had formed a lasting relationship with the company. It meant the company had paid, directly or indirectly, to create a transaction. This is where the economics became difficult. Pet food is heavy. Cat litter is heavy. Shipping heavy, low-margin products to individual homes is not easy. A physical store has its own costs, but customers do part of the transportation work themselves. They drive to the store, pick up the bag, place it in the cart, take it home. An online retailer has to store the goods, process the order, pack it, ship it, handle returns, manage customer service, and still compete on price with the local stores and large chains. In later years, companies would develop more advanced logistics networks, better data systems, subscription models, and more efficient delivery operations. But in 1999 and 2000, the infrastructure was not yet mature enough for every ambitious online retail idea to work at the speed investors wanted. Pets.com tried to solve a difficult business problem by becoming famous quickly. That was not unusual. Brand recognition mattered, and advertising seemed like the way to get it. The company's sock puppet became its main public face. The puppet appeared in commercials and interviews, and eventually in the company's Super Bowl advertising. The Super Bowl mattered because it represented the most expensive and visible advertising stage in American culture. A startup that bought a Super Bowl ad was making a statement larger than the ad itself. It was saying, "We belong here. We are not a small website in a young market. We are a national brand. We are part of the same commercial universe as beer companies, car companies, soda companies, and the giants that had spent decades building recognition." That was the dream. A .com could buy its way into the American household through the front door of television. There was something almost funny about that if you look at it carefully. The internet was supposed to replace or disrupt old media, yet many internet companies used old media to announce themselves. They needed television, magazines, billboards, and radio to tell people to go online. The new economy depended on the old attention systems it claimed to be overtaking. A company could call itself digital, but it still wanted 30 seconds in front of more than 80 million television viewers. It still wanted a memorable slogan. It still wanted a mascot people would talk about at work the next day. The Super Bowl of 2000 became a showcase for the .com mood. Several internet companies bought expensive ads. Some were serious, some were strange, some were trying to be funny. The point was not always to explain the business. The point was to create recognition. Recognition could support traffic. Traffic could support investor interest. Investor interest could support the stock price. The stock price could support hiring and expansion. Each piece depended on the next piece continuing to believe in it. That is why advertising in the bubble was not just advertising, it was part of the financial system. A commercial could help a company seem larger, and seeming larger could help the company keep raising money. This was especially important because many of these companies were losing money. They had what was called a burn rate, meaning the speed at which they spent through cash. Burn rate became one of the defining terms of the period. It had a dramatic sound, and it deserved one. A startup with venture funding or IPO proceeds could spend aggressively for a while, but if money left the company faster than money came in, the clock was always running. The hope was that growth would eventually change the picture. More customers would bring more revenue. More revenue would create scale. Scale would reduce costs. Reduced costs would lead to profits. The sequence was possible in some businesses. It was not guaranteed in all of them. During the boom, the possibility was often treated as if it were already happening. The phrase "get big fast" captured this mood. It was most famously associated with Amazon's early strategy, and Amazon became one of the examples that made other companies believe aggressive growth could be wise. The difficulty is that copying a slogan is easier than copying the conditions that make a strategy work. Amazon had its own challenges and losses, but it was also building systems, customer trust, distribution capability, and a widening product base with unusual discipline beneath the public ambition. Many imitators adopted the spending and the urgency without the same underlying structure. They saw the visible part: growth, losses, expansion, boldness. They did not always see the harder part: execution. Pets.com stood in the middle of that confusion. Its advertising was memorable, but memorable advertising could not erase the basic question of whether the company could profitably sell and ship pet supplies at scale. The company discounted products. It offered convenience. It tried to build awareness quickly. But if the cost of gaining customers and delivering goods remained too high, growth did not fix the problem. Growth could make the losses larger. This was one of the uncomfortable truths that the religion of infinite growth struggled to face. If each customer costs too much to acquire and serve, adding more customers does not automatically lead to salvation. It can simply multiply the weakness. Still, in the late 1990s, many people did not want to hear that. The market rewarded stories of expansion. Investors were often more interested in user growth, revenue growth, and brand visibility than in near-term profit. A company that spent cautiously might be accused of moving too slowly. A company that focused on profitability too early might be seen as lacking ambition. This reversed older instincts. In many businesses, careful spending had been a virtue. In the bubble, careful spending could look like fear. The new question was not always, "Are you making money?" It was, "Are you growing fast enough to matter before someone else takes the market?" The logic spread far beyond Pets.com. Webvan tried to reinvent grocery delivery with enormous infrastructure spending. Cosmo.com promised fast delivery of convenience items in cities, sometimes with no delivery fee. eToys aimed to dominate online toy sales. Boo.com attempted to sell fashion online across international markets, with heavy spending and technical ambition. Many of these companies were based on ideas that would not vanish forever. Online groceries, online toys, rapid delivery, online fashion, these would all become real parts of later commerce in some form. But timing matters in business as much as vision. A good idea too early, built with the wrong costs, funded by impatient money, can fail so spectacularly that people briefly mistake the failure of the company for the failure of the idea. That is one of the great historical ironies of the dot-com crash. Many things the bubble promised did eventually happen. People did buy goods online. They did stream media. They did book travel online. They did use the internet for banking, advertising, job searches, maps, social life, and nearly everything else. The internet believers were broadly correct about the direction of history. They were often wrong about which companies would survive, how long adoption would take, what customers would tolerate, and how much money could be spent before the business model had to prove itself. Being right about the future did not protect a company from running out of cash in the present. This is where the religious metaphor becomes useful, not because the people involved were irrational in a simple way, but because belief began to substitute for evidence. Infinite growth was treated as a destination that justified present suffering. If losses were large, they were proof of ambition. If advertising costs were high, they were proof that the company was building a brand. If customers came only through discounts, the discounts were proof that the company was acquiring market share. If competitors were also losing money, that was not a warning. It was proof that everyone serious understood the same strategy. Doubt became a kind of heresy against the new economy. The rituals were easy to see. The funding announcement, the launch party, the roadshow, the Super Bowl commercial, the analyst report, the magazine profile, the office expansion, the hiring spree. The chart showing traffic rising sharply, the press release about strategic partnerships, the talk of category leadership. Each ritual reassured everyone that the company was moving towards something inevitable. Workers believed because investors believed. Investors believed because the market believed. The market believed because growth appeared on the charts. The charts appeared because money was being spent to create the growth. The circle looked strong until someone asked whether it could stand without fresh money. For ordinary Americans watching this, the spectacle was confusing and fascinating. Here were companies with names that sounded casual, even childish, spending millions of dollars in public while old, familiar companies seemed less exciting. A store that had served a town for decades might be treated as yesterday's business. A website with no profits might be treated as the future. A person could see the contradiction and still feel the pressure. Maybe the old measures really were outdated. Maybe the internet rewarded speed so dramatically that losses were the price of admission. Maybe the people laughing at these companies were missing the point, the way earlier skeptics had missed the personal computer or the telephone. The fear of being wrong about history made people generous toward weak arguments. Pets.com benefited from that generosity until it could not. It went public in early 2000, a moment very near the peak of the market. That timing matters. By then, the excitement had become intense, but the weakness underneath was becoming harder to hide. The Nasdaq would soon begin its long fall. Investors who had tolerated losses became less patient. Capital became harder to raise. Companies that depended on constant funding suddenly had to prove that their business models could survive on their own. For a firm spending heavily and losing money, the change was brutal. Pets.com shut down in November 2000, not long after it had become one of the most visible names of the boom. The speed of the collapse gave the story its lasting force. In less than a year, the company had moved from public market excitement and national advertising to liquidation. Employees lost jobs, investors lost money. The sock puppet, once a cheerful symbol of internet confidence, became a punchline. People who had not followed every detail of the stock market could understand this one. A company had spent heavily to sell pet supplies online, made itself famous, and then disappeared. It seemed to prove that the era had been ridiculous. Late-night jokes could do what financial analysis often could not. They turned complexity into a single image. But it would be too easy to leave Pets.com as only a joke. Doing so lets the rest of the system off too lightly. The company did not rise in isolation. It rose because investors funded it. Banks took it public. Analysts and media treated the broader sector with fascination. And consumers were being taught to expect convenience before the economics of that convenience were fully solved. It rose because the market rewarded growth over discipline. It rose because the culture wanted examples of the internet entering everyday life. It rose because the American dream had been reframed around getting in early, moving fast, and trusting that scale would eventually repair what did not yet work. There is something revealing about the product itself. Pet supplies are not glamorous. They belong to routine. dog food, cat litter, chew toys, flea treatments, scratching posts. These are not luxury objects. They are part of the weekly maintenance of a household. The fact that a company selling such ordinary goods became a symbol of speculative excess tells us how far the bubble had reached. The internet was no longer being imagined only as a tool for researchers, programmers, or adventurous consumers. It was being applied to the most regular parts of domestic life. If the web could take over the pet aisle, perhaps it could take over everything. That idea, take over everything, was the real engine. Investors were not valuing a pet supply company as a pet supply company. They were valuing it as a possible category winner in a transformed retail world. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. An online grocer was not just a grocer. It was the future of food shopping. An online toy seller was not just a toy seller. It was the future of holiday retail. An online pharmacy was not just a pharmacy. It was the future of health commerce. Each company was placed inside a story larger than itself. Once inside that larger story, ordinary weaknesses could be ignored for longer than they should have been. The American dream suffered in this environment because people were encouraged to stop distinguishing between useful innovation and investable fantasy. A service could be convenient and still not profitable. A company could be popular and still not durable. A founder could be visionary and still be wrong about costs. A market could grow and still not support every company chasing it. These distinctions matter in a healthy economy because they protect people from confusing desire with value. The bubble blurred them. It told workers, investors, and consumers that wanting the future badly enough might help make the future arrive on schedule. For the workers inside these companies, the religion of growth had a human cost. Growth meant hiring quickly, reorganizing constantly, working late, changing plans, absorbing pressure, and living with uncertainty while public attention created the illusion of success. Employees at a company like Pets.com could find themselves part of a brand everyone recognized while also knowing that the internal numbers were difficult. That is a strange place to stand. Outside, the puppet is on television. Inside, the company is trying to make the math work. Outside, people assume visibility means strength. Inside, workers know how fast money is being spent. When the end came for many .com firms, it came through practical details rather than dramatic speeches. The next funding round did not arrive. The stock price fell too low to use as currency. The cost of advertising could no longer be justified. Warehouses, leases, and payroll had to be paid in real money, not future optimism. Vendors wanted payment. Customers wanted service. Employees wanted clarity. The business press that had once celebrated boldness began asking sharper questions. The same traits that had been praised as aggressive and visionary were suddenly described as reckless. The shift could feel cruelly fast, but it was not random. The market had changed what it was willing to believe. This is one of the hardest parts of living through a bubble. The facts inside a company may change slowly, but the interpretation of those facts can change overnight. A high burn rate in 1999 might be called investment. The same burn rate in late 2000 might be called a death sentence. A lack of profits might be acceptable when capital is easy. It becomes alarming when capital tightens. A Super Bowl ad might look like genius when the market rewards brand building. It looks foolish when layoffs follow. The behavior did not always change first. The mood changed, and then the behavior was judged under a new light. Pets.com became a warning because it condensed that change into a story simple enough to remember. It showed that being known was not the same as being strong. It showed that a beloved mascot could not fix a broken cost structure. It showed that public markets could embrace a company and abandon it within the same year. It showed that the internet's future was real, but not every company claiming that future had a right to survive. Most of all, it showed that infinite growth was not a business model. It was a temporary agreement among people willing to postpone the question of profit. The trouble was that many lives had already been organised around that postponement. Workers had joined companies because growth would lead to value. Investors had bought shares because value would follow growth. Households had watched the market rise because growth represented national progress. The promise had moved through the culture so completely that when a company like Pets.com failed, it was not only a failed retailer, it was a crack in the mood. If this very visible company could vanish so quickly, what else had been held up by attention rather than strength? What other fortunes were only paper? What other strategies were only spending? What other dreams had been priced as certain while still unproven? At first, many people tried to treat the failures as isolated. A few silly companies had spent too much. A few weak business models would disappear. The stronger firms would remain. There was truth in that. Some companies did remain. The internet itself was not going away. But bubbles do not require every company to be fake. They require enough companies, investors, and institutions to overstate the present value of the future. Once confidence weakened, the sorting process became harsh. The market began asking questions it had delayed for years. How much cash do you have? How fast are you burning it? Can you raise more? Do customers return without discounts? Can you survive if advertising slows? When will you make money? Not traffic, not attention, money. Those questions had always been there, waiting. During the boom, they were pushed aside by the urgency to grow. After the mood shifted, they returned with force. The same country that had been told to admire speed now began to rediscover arithmetic. And arithmetic was not sentimental. It did not care about mascots, magazine covers, clever domain names, or the excitement of being early. It did not care that workers had options or investors had retirement hopes attached to the stock. It did not care that a company had once been described as a category killer. It asked whether more cash came in than went out. And for many dot-com companies, the answer was no. By the time people understood how serious that answer was, the market had already begun to turn. The screens that had once made ordinary investors feel rich started to show something else. Red numbers, falling charts. Stocks that had seemed temporarily weak became permanently damaged. Companies that had promised expansion began cutting staff. Offices built for growth began to feel too large. The advertising slowed. The jokes became sharper. The confidence that had carried the boom into American homes began to drain away, first unevenly, then unmistakably. The religion of infinite growth had met a limit, and the limit was not philosophical. It was cash, patience, and a market that no longer wanted to pay for promises at yesterday's prices. The end did not arrive with one clean sound. That is one of the things people misunderstand about market collapses when they look back later. From a distance, history smooths the event into a date, a peak, a fall, a line on a chart that rises too high and then bends downward. It looks obvious. It looks almost organized. But for the people living through it, the first days of the dot-com collapse did not feel like a collapse in the way we imagine one now. They felt like bad days, then a bad week, then a correction, then a buying opportunity, then something deeper, stranger, and harder to name. On March 10th, 2000, the Nasdaq Composite reached its peak above 5,000. That number mattered because the Nasdaq had become the scoreboard of the new economy. It held many of the technology names people talked about at work and watched at home. It was the index that seemed to prove the future was accelerating. When it climbed, the country saw more than stock prices. It saw confirmation. It saw the value of startups, retirement accounts, stock options, mutual funds, and business plans rising together. It saw the market saying yes to all the things people had been telling themselves for years. Yes, the internet is different. Yes, the old rules are changing. Yes, growth matters more than profits right now. Yes, the future is worth paying for in advance. Then the screens began to change colour. Imagine an ordinary workday in the spring of 2000. Not a dramatic morning at first. People are arriving with coffee, elevators are opening, keycards are tapping against office doors, computers are waking up from sleep. In technology offices, the day begins with email, bug reports, product meetings, recruiting calls, and the quiet habit of checking the stock price. Some people pretend they are not checking as often as they are. Some keep a small browser window open behind their work. Some have alerts, some watch message boards. Some refresh the price as if staring at it might help hold it in place. For months, a falling price had usually meant a temporary interruption in a larger rise. That had trained people. If the stock dipped, it might come back. If the market wobbled, analysts would explain why the long-term story remained strong. If a company fell after earnings, someone would say the sell-off was overdone. This habit of reassurance was one of the last things to die. On the first red mornings, many people reached for the old explanations: profit-taking, rotation, nervousness, a healthy correction. Investors locking in gains, temporary volatility. The kind of language that makes a fall sound like maintenance rather than damage. But the red kept spreading. The crash was not only a financial event, it was a change in atmosphere. In the boom, screens had become instruments of comfort. They told people their accounts were growing, their options were valuable, their risks were being rewarded. In the collapse, the same screens became sources of dread. The exact object that had delivered proof of progress now delivered proof that progress could reverse. A worker who had once checked the stock price with excitement began checking it with a tight feeling in the chest. A retiree who had watched a mutual fund climb now watched it give back years of gains. A day trader who had believed speed was an advantage discovered that speed could deliver losses just as quickly. The first losses were often survivable on paper. That made them harder to interpret. A stock that had gone from 20 to 80 could fall to 60 and still look like a success. A company whose shares had doubled could lose a quarter of its value and still remain above the IPO price. People told themselves they were still ahead. They told themselves the stock had risen too fast and needed to settle. They told themselves that no real wealth had been lost because they had never planned to sell that day anyway. In a boom, holding is described as conviction. In the early phase of a crash, holding becomes a way to avoid admitting that the story might have changed. There is a small private ritual that happened in many households during those months. Someone would log in to an account after dinner, perhaps after the children were asleep, and look at the balance. Not long before, that number had carried a feeling of comfort. It had suggested early retirement, a safer future, college tuition, a house, a cushion against uncertainty. Now the number was smaller. Maybe not ruined yet, but smaller enough to require a recalculation. The person would sit there for a minute longer than necessary, doing the mental work that markets force on people during downturns. If it comes back, we are fine. If it drops another 10%, we should still be fine. If we sell now, we lock in the loss. If we do not sell, it might get worse. What if this is temporary? What if it is not? That question moved quietly through the country. What if it is not temporary? At first, many people could not accept that possibility because the rise had lasted long enough to feel normal. A person who started investing in the late 1990s had learned a particular version of the market. Technology went up. Internet companies were volatile but rewarding. Analysts were optimistic. Pullbacks were chances to buy. The market might scare you, but it usually came back stronger. This is the way any long rise educates the people inside it. It does not need to teach a formal lesson. It teaches through repetition. Each recovery tells investors that patience will be rewarded. Each new high makes the last out look foolish. By the time the real turn comes, many people have been trained to mistake danger for opportunity. The broader economy also seemed strong enough to support hope. This was not 1929, at least not in the way people imagined 1929. The country was not in a visible depression. Stores were open, offices were full, people were working. Consumer confidence had been high. The federal government was even running budget surpluses, something that now feels like a detail from another country. Technology still mattered. The internet was still growing. People still believed online life would become larger. Because much of that was true, it became easier to argue that the market decline was only a shakeout. The weak firms would fail, the strong firms would survive, and the future would continue with less nonsense. That argument was partly right. It was also too gentle for what was coming. Several pressures had been building before the collapse. The Federal Reserve had raised interest rates in the late 1990s and into 2000, trying to keep the economy from overheating. Higher rates made speculative assets less comfortable and made easy money feel slightly less easy. Many dot-com companies were spending heavily and needed constant access to fresh capital. Insider lock-up periods were expiring, allowing early holders in some companies to sell. More investors were beginning to question whether businesses with no profits could justify enormous valuations. The Microsoft antitrust ruling in April 2000 also added to the sense that even the strongest technology names were not immune from government and market pressure. None of these factors alone explains everything. Together they helped weaken the mood, and mood mattered. The market had been held up by expectations, and expectations are sensitive. When people believe prices will rise, they tolerate weakness. When they believe prices might keep falling, they demand proof. The dot-com companies did not suddenly become different companies overnight. Many had the same offices, the same employees, the same products, the same plans, and the same slogans they had used the month before. What changed was the market's willingness to fund the gap between today's losses and tomorrow's imagined profits. That gap had been called vision during the boom. During the crash, it began to look like exposure. The selling fed on itself. A falling stock price frightened investors, which pushed them to sell, which pushed prices lower, which frightened more investors. Margin made the problem worse for those who had borrowed money to buy shares. A margin account allowed investors to purchase stocks using borrowed funds, increasing potential gains when prices rose. During the boom, margin could make people feel clever. During the decline, it became a trap. When stocks fell, brokers could issue margin calls, requiring investors to deposit more cash or sell holdings to cover the loan. Forced selling did not wait for optimism. It did not care whether the investor believed in the long-term future of the internet. It required action. In a market already falling, forced selling added more pressure. Day traders felt this quickly. The late 1990s had produced a culture of ordinary people trading from home or from day trading offices, using fast quotes and online platforms to move in and out of stocks. Some were skilled, many were not. A rising market had made quick profits seem more available than they really were. The crash punished that illusion. Stocks that had once jumped on rumour or excitement began dropping without mercy. Volatility increased. A person who had built confidence during the easy years could lose it in a week. The screen that once seemed to offer independence began to feel like a machine built to reveal mistakes. Inside dot-com offices, the mood changed unevenly. Some companies tried to project calm. Executives told employees to focus on the mission. The stock price was not the business, they said. Markets fluctuate, they said. We are building for the long term. Some of that was sincere. Leaders needed workers to keep working. Products still had to ship. Customers still needed service. Servers still had to run. But everyone knew the stock price mattered. It affected morale, fundraising, acquisitions, hiring, and the value of employee options. In a public company, the market was not outside the building. It came inside every day. One of the cruelest phrases of the crash was underwater options. It meant the stock price had fallen below the strike price of employee options, making them worthless unless the stock recovered. The phrase sounds technical, but the experience was personal. Someone who had worked nights and weekends believing the options would pay for a house could discover that the options had no current value, not less value, no value. The person still had the memories of the missed dinners, the stress, the postponed plans, the loyalty. The company still had the benefit of that labour, but the reward had sunk beneath the surface. This changed the psychology of work. During the boom, options had tied employees to companies, because leaving meant abandoning potential wealth. During the crash, underwater options lost that power. Workers began asking why they were accepting long hours and instability without the upside that had justified them. Recruiters were not calling as often. Competing startups were not offering the same packages. Some employees stayed because they believed the company would recover. Others stayed because there was nowhere better to go. The feeling shifted from chosen mission to trapped uncertainty, and that is a very different kind of workday. For founders, the red screens were often a direct threat to survival. A high stock price could be used to raise money, acquire other companies, attract employees, and signal strength. A falling stock price did the opposite. It made investors cautious. It made employees restless. It made customers wonder whether the company would be around to honour orders, warranties, or services. It made vendors tighten payment terms. Public companies that had planned to return to the market for more cash found that the window had closed. Private companies that expected another venture round discovered that investors were no longer rewarding growth without discipline. The phrase cash runway became more urgent. How many months could the company survive at its current burn rate? 6? 4? 2? In the boom, running out of money had often seemed like a temporary problem. Raise another round. Go public, get acquired, use stock, expand the story. In the crash, those exits narrowed. IPOs were postponed or cancelled. Acquisitions became harder because the acquirer's own stock had fallen. Venture capital firms began protecting their strongest portfolio companies instead of funding every ambitious plan. The companies that had built themselves for constant forward motion suddenly had to stop, cut, and prove. Many were not designed for that. They had leased offices for growth that did not arrive. They had hired staff for expansion that was now impossible. They had spent heavily on marketing to create customers they could not profitably serve. The red screens reached beyond technology companies. Advertising firms felt it. Commercial landlords felt it. Recruiters felt it. Caterers, office furniture suppliers, web design shops, public relations firms, and local restaurants near startup clusters felt it. During the boom, the dot-com economy had created a ring of supporting businesses. A funded startup did not only hire programmers, it bought desks, phones, servers, legal advice, accounting services, snacks, event space, marketing campaigns, and consulting. When the startups cut spending, that entire ring tightened. A bubble creates jobs outside the bubble. A crash removes them there too. The public language changed almost as fast as the prices. Words that had sounded smart in 1999 began to sound foolish in 2000. Eyeballs, stickiness, portal, new paradigm, get big fast, first mover advantage. These terms did not vanish, but they lost their spell. People started saying burn rate with a harsher tone. Reporters who had once described young founders as visionaries began asking about losses. Investors who had praised growth began demanding profitability. Analysts revised price targets. The old economy, which had been mocked as slow, began to look less ridiculous. A grocery store that made money selling groceries suddenly seemed more respectable than an online grocer losing money at scale. There is a temptation to imagine that everyone instantly understood the magnitude of what was happening. They did not. Many believed the worst had passed several times before it truly had. Markets bounced. Stocks recovered for a few days or weeks. Commentators called bottoms that were not bottoms. Each rally revived hope. The people who had lost money wanted to believe recovery was near because the alternative required accepting real damage. A stock down 50% had to rise 100% just to return to its prior price. But many investors did not think in those terms. They remembered the old high as if it were a natural home the stock might revisit. They were waiting for prices to return to where belief had left them. That waiting could last a long time. The Nasdaq's fall from its peak would eventually erase an enormous portion of its value by 2002. But on the first red mornings, that full decline was not visible. What people saw was the beginning. A favourite stock down sharply. A fund statement lower than last quarter. A company email from leadership urging focus. A news segment asking whether internet stocks had been overvalued. A friend who had been excited now speaking quietly. A spouse asking if the money for the down payment was still there. A co-worker suddenly worried about layoffs. The collapse arrived through details before it became a historical fact. For ordinary households, this was where the American dream began to feel unstable in a new way. The market had been presented as a path to security. Retirement accounts, college savings and investment portfolios had become part of how families imagined the future. When those accounts fell, people did not only lose money, they lost time. A 55-year-old whose retirement savings declined could not simply become 45 again. A family saving for college could not rewind tuition deadlines. A worker who had counted on options to buy a home could not easily replace years spent at a failing company. Losses in a market are measured in dollars, but in a household they are often felt as delayed lives. Some people sold quickly and preserved what they could. Some held through the fall. Some bought more, convinced that the strongest companies would recover. Some had no idea what to do. The advice was contradictory. Stay the course. Cut your losses. Buy quality. Avoid speculation. Do not panic. Take profits. Rebalance. Believe in technology. Forget technology. For a person without deep financial training, the noise could be overwhelming. The same experts who had sounded confident on the way up often sounded confident on the way down, even when their advice had changed. That damaged trust. Not all at once, but quietly. People began to wonder whether anyone had really understood what they were selling. In offices where the stock had fallen, the human signs became harder to ignore. Hiring freezes, travel restrictions, a cancelled off-site meeting, fewer snacks in the kitchen, empty desks not refilled after people left, a finance person asking teams to justify software subscriptions, managers closing conference room doors more often. The first layoffs were sometimes presented as strategic adjustments, a small reduction, a refocusing, a move toward profitability. The language tried to make pain sound planned, but employees understood the direction. The company that had once been racing to hire now had to decide who was necessary. The morning the screens turned red was not one morning really. It was a season of mornings. Each one taught people a little more about how much of the boom had depended on confidence. A stock price could fall before the office opened. A company could lose half its value while employees were still answering customer emails. A retirement account could shrink while its owner was at work earning an hourly wage. The screen made wealth visible, and then it made loss visible. It showed people that the numbers they had trusted were not stored safely somewhere. They were constantly being renegotiated by strangers. This was the moment when the dot-com dream began to separate into two realities. The internet as a technology continued forward. More people came online. More businesses used the web. More daily activities moved toward digital systems. That part of the dream was not dead, but the internet as a guaranteed wealth machine was breaking. The belief that every website with traffic could become a fortune was breaking. The belief that losses did not matter if the story was large enough was breaking. The belief that ordinary workers could trade security for options and reliably come out ahead was breaking. The technology survived. The fantasy around it did not. And once that fantasy weakened, the damage moved from screens into rooms. Office parks that had been planned for expansion had to absorb silence. Startups that had held launch parties now held all hands, meetings with nervous faces. People who had once calculated paper fortunes began calculating severance, rent, and health insurance. The red numbers were no longer only numbers. They were becoming empty chairs, cancelled leases, moving boxes, and resumes quietly updated after midnight. The market had spoken first, but the workplace would speak next, and what it said would be much harder to dismiss as a temporary correction. The first sign was often not an announcement. It was a small absence, a desk that stayed empty too long, a hiring manager who stopped returning calls, a weekly meeting removed from the calendar without explanation, the snack delivery that became smaller, the travel budget that suddenly required approval. A conference room booked all morning by executives who came out looking too calm. In the boom years, growth had made noise. New desks, new badges, new names on the email list, new office space, new boxes of equipment arriving in the lobby. The downturn made a different sound. It was quieter. It sounded like things not happening. Inside the dot-com offices, people learned to read those signs quickly. They had to. A startup was never as solid as it looked from the outside, and workers understood that even when they tried not to say it aloud. The company could have a recognizable brand, a lively website, venture capital backing, and a polished reception area, but still be only a few months away from running out of money. Once the market turned, that knowledge moved from the back of the mind to the front. Employees watched cash become the main subject of every conversation. Cash runway, cash burn, cash conservation. The same company that had once told people to move fast and think big now told them to print less, travel less, hire less, spend less, and focus. Focus sounded reasonable. It usually meant the company was shrinking. A layoff meeting has its own atmosphere. Anyone who has sat through one remembers the details, even if they try not to. People are called into rooms in groups, or one by one. Some know before they enter. Others hope until the last second that the meeting is about something else. A manager reads from language prepared with legal advice. The decision was difficult. The company is restructuring. The market has changed. We need to preserve capital. We're grateful for your contributions. There may be a packet of papers, a severance explanation, a date when health insurance ends, instructions about company property, and a reminder that questions should go through human resources. The words are designed to be orderly because the event itself is not. In the dot-com bust, layoffs came in waves. At first, a company might cut a small percentage and insist the move would make it stronger. Then another cut followed. Then a division closed. Then a merger failed. Then the company shut down entirely. Workers who survived the first round often did not feel safe. They felt temporarily spared. The office changed after layoffs. It is hard to explain this if you have not felt it. The furniture stays, but the room is different. The quiet is not peaceful. It is watchful. A person passes a desk that used to belong to someone funny, or difficult, or generous, or simply familiar, and now the chair is pushed in and the monitor is gone. The company may remove names from doors quickly, but memory does not move that fast. The empty cubicle became one of the physical symbols of the bust. Cubicles had already represented a certain kind of American work life. Ordinary, fluorescent, repetitive, not glamorous. Dot-com culture had tried to make the office feel different. Open plans, couches, toys, free food, bright colours, strange mascots, game rooms, casual clothes, late-night energy. But when the money ran out, the office became ordinary again very quickly. A foosball table in a company that is laying off workers does not look playful. It looks abandoned. A wall painted in cheerful colours looks almost embarrassing when employees are carrying boxes to their cars. The decor of the boom did not age slowly. It turned overnight into evidence. Some companies did not even have time to manage the decline gracefully. They closed with little warning. Employees arrived to locked doors or sudden meetings. Email accounts stopped working. Badge access was disabled. Equipment was gathered. Vendors called looking for payment. Customers discovered that support lines no longer answered. Websites remained online for a while like empty storefronts with the lights left on, then disappeared. In the physical world, the remains were sold. Desks, chairs, computers, servers, conference tables, routers, espresso machines, whiteboards, artwork, and the famous ergonomic chairs that had filled startup offices went to auction. The liquidation sale became a kind of public autopsy. Here was the material body of the dream, priced item by item. There was something especially cruel about seeing expensive office furniture sold for a fraction of its cost. During the boom, those purchases had been justified as part of recruiting and culture. A company wanted to look serious, comfortable, modern, well-funded. Workers were spending long hours there, so the office became a second home, or at least that was how the spending was explained. During the bust, the same objects looked like evidence of poor judgment. The chairs, the branded mugs, the lobby signs, the catered meal equipment, all of it seemed to ask how many paychecks might have lasted longer if less money had been spent making the company feel inevitable. Of course, that question is too simple. A few chairs did not destroy the dot-com economy. A few parties did not bring down the Nasdaq. The deeper problem was not the office decor. It was the system of belief that made speed more important than durability. Still, physical objects matter because they are what people remember. A worker may not remember every line of the balance sheet, but he remembers packing his desk into a cardboard box while the company's motivational poster still hung near the kitchen. He remembers the branded sweatshirt he never wore again. He remembers the badge clipped to his belt that stopped opening the door. He remembers the stock option paperwork in a folder at home, the pages that once looked like a map to a different life. Broken stock options were not dramatic from the outside. They did not make noise. They did not appear as shattered glass. They remained documents, account entries, numbers attached to a price that no longer helped anyone. But for employees, they carried the weight of a broken agreement. Not always a legal agreement, often something more emotional. The company had said, "Take the risk with us, and you will share the reward." The employees had accepted long hours, unstable management, lower cash pay in some cases, and the constant pressure of a company racing to become real before the money ran out. When the stock collapsed, the options became a record of risk transferred downward. This is important because options were often described as ownership. That word ownership has a warm sound in American life. It suggests independence, stake, dignity, a claim. But many employees discovered that their ownership was fragile. If the stock price fell below the exercise price, the option had no immediate value. If the company failed, the option vanished. If the employee left, there might be a short window to exercise, requiring cash and tax risk at exactly the moment the person had lost a job. For workers who had not fully understood the complexity, the paperwork could become a second injury. They had been told they were owners, but in the collapse they felt much closer to unsecured believers. Some had exercised options before the crash and faced painful tax consequences. Incentive stock options could trigger alternative minimum tax obligations based on paper gains, even if the stock later collapsed before the worker sold. That meant a person might owe taxes on wealth that no longer existed in usable form. This was one of those technical details that almost no one built into the dream when the market was rising. In the recruiting pitch, option sounded like upside. In the bust, they revealed a hidden complexity that many ordinary workers were not prepared to handle. The financial system had given them instruments that looked like opportunity, but required knowledge, timing, and luck to use safely. For the workers who lost jobs, the practical problems arrived quickly. Rent was still due, student loans were still due, childcare still cost money. Health insurance, especially in the United States, was tied closely to employment for many people, so losing a job could also mean entering the confusing and expensive world of continuation coverage. A person who had spent the previous year calculating paper gains might now be calculating how many months of savings remained. A household that had moved to a high-cost region for a technology job could find itself trapped between falling job prospects and a lease or mortgage priced for boom times. The geography of the bust mattered. In Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, Austin, and other technology centers, the boom had drawn people in. Workers relocated from other states and countries because opportunity seemed concentrated there. When layoffs spread, many were far from family support. Some had moved with spouses and children. Some had bought homes near the top of the market. Some were in the United States on work visas and faced not only unemployment, but the possibility of having to leave the country if they could not find another qualifying job quickly. The dot-com dream had been sold as borderless and digital, but its collapse was felt very physically in apartments, immigration paperwork, school enrollments, and moving trucks. People outside the glamorous technical roles were hit as well, and their stories were often told less loudly. Receptionists, office coordinators, customer service staff, warehouse workers, delivery drivers, sales assistants, junior marketers, content moderators before that term became widely used, and support workers of many kinds helped keep dot-com companies operating. They did not always receive large option grants. They did not always have savings or high salaries. They were less likely to be profiled during the boom and easier to forget during the bust. But they had taken the risk too, sometimes without receiving much of the upside even on paper. When the company folded, the loss was not a vanished fantasy of millions. It was a missing paycheck. This is where the language of entrepreneurship can become unfair. After the crash, some people described dot-com workers as greedy, foolish, or spoiled. There was some truth in the criticism for certain executives and investors who had promoted weak companies aggressively, sold shares at the right time, or treated public markets like a dumping ground for risk. But it is lazy to place every worker inside that judgment. Many employees were doing ordinary work under extraordinary expectations. They built websites, answered phones, wrote code, packed orders, negotiated vendor contracts, handled complaints, prepared marketing copy, tested products, maintained servers, and tried to keep promises their companies had made too easily. They were not all gamblers. Many were workers inside a gamble designed above them. The collapse also damaged the social fabric inside the offices that remained. Layoffs create survivors, and surviving a layoff can carry its own burden. The people left behind often inherit more work, lower morale, and the knowledge that their relief depends on someone else's loss. They may feel grateful and guilty at the same time. They may stop trusting leadership. They may update their resumes while attending meetings about renewed focus. The company may ask for loyalty at exactly the moment it has demonstrated that loyalty is conditional. This contradiction was everywhere after the dot-com crash. Workers had been told they were family, team, mission, culture. Then they learned how quickly those words could be rewritten by cash flow. The American workplace had been moving in this direction for years, but the dot-com bust made the pattern more visible. Companies wanted the emotional commitment of a community with the flexibility of a market transaction. They wanted employees to work like owners, accept risk like entrepreneurs, and remain disposable like costs. During the boom, stock options blurred that contradiction. During the bust, the blur cleared. A worker could be told to pour herself into a company because they were all building something together, and then be released with a packet, a short meeting, and a reminder to return her laptop. This did not destroy ambition, but it made ambition more wary. Many workers who lived through the bust carried lessons into later technology cycles. They learned to ask about business models, cash reserves, vesting schedules, liquidation preferences, and the difference between a high valuation and a real exit. They learned that company culture could be sincere and still not protect them. They learned that a famous brand could fail. They learned that a startup's energy was not the same as stability. Some became more cautious. Others went back into new startups anyway, because the possibility remained attractive and the technology industry did recover in time. But even those who returned often carried a memory of how fast the mood could turn. The psychological damage was harder to measure than the financial damage. For a young worker, the bust could feel like humiliation. The company that had sounded so important at parties was gone. The job title that had looked impressive now belonged to a failed experiment. The options that once seemed like proof of future wealth were worthless. People had to explain to parents, spouses, friends, and themselves what had happened. Some had encouraged others to invest. Some had persuaded partners to move. Some had turned down safer jobs. Shame is one of the quiet after-effects of bubbles. It makes people feel personally foolish for believing what entire markets, media systems and institutions had also believed. There was anger too, but it did not always know where to go. Toward founders who spent too much, toward venture capitalists who pushed growth, toward analysts who kept recommending stocks, toward investment banks that took companies public before they were ready, toward employees themselves for wanting the upside, toward a culture that had treated caution as weakness. The crash had many causes and many participants, which made blame difficult to place neatly. That difficulty helped the system move on faster than some of the workers could. Institutions can rename a period and continue. Individuals have to rebuild their lives. The public story of the dot-com bust often focused on investors, but the workers experienced a more intimate version. Investors lost money, sometimes enormous amounts. Workers lost money too, but also identity, routine, community, health coverage, immigration stability, and time. They lost the future they had organised themselves around. An employee who had worked 3 years at a failed startup did not simply lose a job. She lost 3 years in which she might have built seniority elsewhere, saved more cash, finished a degree, started a family sooner, or chosen a different city. Those alternate lives are impossible to calculate, but workers feel them. The office parks made the loss visible. In some regions, buildings planned for growth stood partly empty. Leasing signs appeared where companies had expected expansion. Parking lots thinned out. Restaurants that had counted on lunch crowds lost business. Recruiters who had once been overwhelmed by hiring demands now had candidates with similar stories. The economy that had seemed weightless turned out to occupy a great deal of space. It had leases, commutes, lunch orders, office furniture, janitorial contracts, server rooms, and local tax expectations. When it shrank, the emptiness was not digital. It was square footage. A person driving through one of these corridors after the bus could see how hope had been built into physical form. Low-rise office buildings with tinted glass, landscaped entrances, company signs removed, leaving faint marks on the wall, mail piled in lobbies, conference rooms visible through windows. It was not the ruin of an ancient city, but it had a modern version of that feeling. Places built for activity now waiting for someone else's plan. The dot-com bubble had promised that the future would not need the old factories, but it still produced its own abandoned workplaces. Some workers tried to reinvent themselves quickly. Technology skills remained valuable, especially for those with strong engineering backgrounds. Others had a harder time. The boom had created roles tied to specific business models that no longer existed. Content partnerships, portal strategy, online community management, customer acquisition for unprofitable services, brand work for vanished startups. A resume full of dot-com experience could be an advantage in one room and a warning in another. Employers asked whether candidates had learned discipline. Workers learned to translate their past into language that sounded less like the bubble. Growth became operations. Chaos became adaptability. Failure became experience. For many, the next job paid less or felt smaller. That could be painful, but also grounding. A person who had lived inside constant talk of disruption might find relief in a company that made money in a boring way. A regular paycheck regained dignity. Health insurance regained importance. A manager who did not promise to change the world could seem honest. After speculative eras, ordinary stability often looks better than it did before. The problem was that stability had become harder to find for many workers across the broader economy, and the bust did not reverse that trend. It simply taught people that risk had been oversold. The workers left behind also included those who had never stepped inside a dot-com office. Ordinary investors with retirement accounts, families whose mutual funds fell, people in communities that had hoped technology would bring new prosperity. Small businesses that had supplied startups and were not paid in full when they failed. Landlords left with vacant space. cities that had expected tax revenue from growth. The bubble had expanded the circle of participation, and the crash expanded the circle of loss. This is why the dot-com bust cannot be dismissed as a problem for young people, with too much confidence and too many stock options. The effects moved outward. There is a broader historical point here. The dot-com bubble did not create the shift from secure employment to individual risk, but it made that shift look exciting for a while. It wrapped insecurity in the language of opportunity. It told workers that the absence of guarantees was freedom. It told them that unstable companies could be better than stable ones because unstable companies offered upside. It told them that being always available, always adapting, always ready to move was not exhaustion, but modern ambition. Then, when the crash came, many discovered that the upside had been optional for the company, and the downside had been mandatory for them. The broken stock option became a lesson in how the American dream had changed. Earlier versions of the dream had their own exclusions and failures, but they often rested on tangible goals: a home, a pension, savings, a family business, a trade, a farm, a profession. The dot-com dream rested heavily on valuation. It asked people to believe that market recognition could become personal security. When the valuation vanished, the dream did not leave much behind for many workers except experience, and a story they were not always eager to tell. Still, not everything was lost. Skills remained. Friendships remained. Some companies survived. Some workers moved on to build better things with more discipline. The internet continued to grow into the infrastructure of daily life. But the human cost of the bust stayed buried beneath the cleaner story of technological progress. Later, people would say the crash was necessary, a clearing out of weak companies, a painful but useful correction. There is truth in that from a distance. Markets do sometimes clear excess. Bad companies do fail. Capital does get reallocated. The difficulty is that phrases like clearing out do not show you the person carrying a box to his car, wondering how to tell his spouse. They do not show the worker on a visa with 30 days to find another job. They do not show the customer service employee whose options were never enough to matter, and whose savings will last 6 weeks. They do not show the quiet drive home after the badge stops working. That quiet drive is part of the history too. So is the apartment where someone spread severance papers across the table. So is the resume rewritten at midnight. So is the phone call to parents that begins with, "I'm fine," before admitting that the company is gone. So is the storage closet where the company t-shirts remain in unopened boxes because there is no company picnic now, no launch party, no next version, no future big enough to absorb the spending that came before. The dot-com bust was made of indexes and valuations, yes, but also of ordinary rooms where people recalculated their lives. By the time the office lights went out in enough places, the country had begun to understand that something larger than a market correction had happened. The internet had not failed, but a promise attached to it had. The promise that risk would be fairly rewarded. The promise that workers could trade security for equity and reliably come out ahead. The promise that the future would make room for anyone willing to believe early enough. The promise that new technology could repair the old anxieties of American life. When the cubicles emptied and the options broke, what remained was not only unemployment or lost savings. It was a deeper suspicion, a feeling that the dream had been moved again just as people were reaching for it, and that suspicion would follow American workers long after the failed websites disappeared from the screen. The internet did not die. That is the first thing that has to be said plainly, because it is one of the reasons the dot-com bubble is so easy to misunderstand. The crash did not prove that the web was useless. It did not prove that online shopping, search, digital advertising, streaming, online banking, social life or remote work would never matter. In fact, many of the broad claims made during the boom later came true in one form or another. The internet did become part of daily life. It did change business. It did reshape media, commerce, communication, and work. Some companies that survived the crash became enormous. Some ideas that failed in 2000 returned years later with better timing, better infrastructure, and more disciplined execution. That is what makes the damage harder to see. When a failed dream is completely false, people can point at the ruins and move on. When a failed dream is partly true, it stays inside the culture. It changes shape. It becomes harder to separate the useful lesson from the injury. The dot-com bubble did not take the internet away from America. It took something quieter. It took a certain innocence about the relationship between technology and progress. It took the confidence that innovation would naturally lift ordinary people with it. It took the belief that if you worked hard inside the future would be fair to you. Before the bubble, technology had often been sold as a tool of possibility. Computers would make workers more productive. Networks would connect people. The web would open access. Information would move more freely. Small players could challenge large ones. Geography would matter less. New companies would create new jobs. Old limits would weaken. These ideas were not empty. Many were rooted in real changes. But during the bubble, the language of possibility became attached to a financial machine that did not distribute rewards evenly. The benefits flowed first and fastest to founders, early investors, investment banks, executives, and those able to sell at the right time. The risks spread more widely, reaching employees, late investors, retirement savers, communities, and ordinary households that had been encouraged to believe the new economy was a safer path to the old dream. That old dream had always been complicated. It was never available equally to everyone. It had exclusions built into it from the beginning, by race, gender, class, geography, immigration status, and law. It had been denied to many even when others held it up as a national promise. Still, for much of the 20th century, the mainstream version of the American dream offered a basic outline that millions recognized. Steady work, rising wages, home ownership, family stability, education for children, retirement with dignity, and the hope that the next generation might stand on slightly higher ground. It did not always work, but it was understandable. People knew what they were being asked to do. Work, save, wait, build. The dot-com bubble did not erase that outline in one stroke. It replaced parts of it with a faster, more unstable version. Instead of steady work, there was the start-up grind. Instead of a pension, there was the 401k, the stock grant, the option package, the mutual fund tied to market performance. Instead of saving slowly, there was the chance to get in early. Instead of the company rewarding loyalty over decades, there was the company asking for total commitment now, in exchange for potential upside later. Instead of a home as the centre of wealth, there was equity in something that might go public, might be acquired, might vanish, or might remain valuable only long enough for someone else to sell. This changed how people understood risk. In earlier versions of middle-class security, risk was something to be managed carefully. You avoided debt you could not handle. You kept savings. You chose a stable employer if you could. You bought insurance. You stayed cautious because family life required a margin of safety. In the dot-com years, risk was repackaged as courage. A worker who chose a startup over a stable job was not reckless. He was bold. An investor who concentrated in technology was not gambling. She was participating in transformation. A founder burning through millions was not irresponsible. He was moving fast before competitors arrived. The moral language shifted. Caution became backward. Skepticism became fear. Patience became a failure to understand the speed of history. When the crash came, that language did not simply disappear. It left people with a more difficult lesson. Risk had been praised when workers carried it, but losses were treated as private problems when the market turned. The employee with worthless options had to rebuild alone. The retiree whose fund had fallen had to adjust alone. The laid-off worker had to find health insurance alone. The person who moved across the country for a company that closed had to pack and explain it alone. The culture had invited them into a shared future, but the aftermath was individual. That is one of the things the bubble took from the American dream. It weakened the sense that the bargain was mutual. The bargain had already been weakening, but the bubble made it visible in a new way. Companies had spent years asking employees to be flexible, adaptable, entrepreneurial, and personally responsible for their own advancement. The dot-com era pushed this further. It told workers to think like owners without giving them the protections of owners. It told them to accept instability because instability was where the rewards were. It told them that the line between job and investment had blurred, and that this blur was modern. Then, when companies failed, the line reappeared. Executives negotiated. Investors wrote off losses and moved capital elsewhere. Some founders started again. Workers carried gaps in resumes, unpaid bills, broken plans, and a more careful attitude toward promises. The dream of ownership survived, but it became more financial and less secure. Owning a home had once been the central symbol, though even that had never been simple or equally accessible. During and after the dot-com years, ownership increasingly meant exposure to markets. Retirement accounts, stock options, employee share plans, mutual funds, index funds, home values, all tied ordinary lives more tightly to asset prices. This could create wealth, and for some people it did. But it also meant that the path to security depended more heavily on timing, market cycles, and financial knowledge. People were told they were empowered because they had more control over their financial futures. In reality, many had more responsibility without enough protection. That is a hard shift to live inside. Responsibility sounds dignified. Control sounds freeing. But responsibility without power is often just exposure. A worker can choose how to invest a retirement account, but she cannot control a market bubble. An employee can accept stock options, but he cannot control whether capital dries up before the company reaches profitability. A family can buy into a growing region, but it cannot control whether the local economy collapses after a wave of startup failures. The dot-com crash taught many Americans that the new economy gave them more ways to participate in growth, but also more ways to absorb decline. It also changed trust in expertise. During the boom, analysts, bankers, executives, fund managers, journalists, and television commentators had spoken with confidence. Not all of them were wrong in the same way. Not all were dishonest. Some genuinely believed the internet had changed valuation. Some were swept up in the same mood as everyone else. Some had conflicts of interest that should have been taken more seriously. The public did not always know which was which. After the crash, the distinction mattered less emotionally. People remembered the confidence. They remembered the buy recommendations. They remembered the magazine covers. They remembered being told that old metrics did not apply. When the losses arrived, trust weakened. This weakening did not stay confined to internet stocks. The early 2000s brought other corporate scandals, including accounting failures and fraud at major companies outside the pure dot-com world. Enron and WorldCom became names associated with a broader crisis of corporate trust. For many Americans, the timing blended into one mood. The market had fallen, technology promises had broken, major corporations had lied, retirement accounts had suffered. Executives seemed protected in ways ordinary employees were not. The lesson many people absorbed was not only that some internet companies had been overvalued, it was that the people at the top often understood the game better than those invited in late. This is one reason the dot-com crash matters beyond the charts. It helped teach a generation of workers to be cynical about corporate language. Mission, culture, disruption, family, passion, ownership, upside, changing the world. These words did not disappear. If anything, they became even more common in later technology cycles. But for people who had lived through the bust, the words carried a second meaning. They knew a company could speak like a community and act like a balance sheet. They knew a job could be framed as a calling until the money ran out. They knew free food and casual clothes did not change who carried the risk when things went wrong. At the same time, the crash did not end the desire to believe. This is another uncomfortable truth. People still wanted the dream. They still wanted work to mean something. They still wanted technology to open doors. They still wanted the possibility that a person without inherited wealth could build a better life through talent, effort, and timing. The dot-com bust made people more skeptical, but it did not remove the hunger that the bubble had exploited. In later years, new companies would rise with new promises. Social media, smartphones, cloud computing, apps, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, and other technologies would each carry versions of the same old invitation. Come early, understand before others do, take the risk. The future is being built, and there may be a place for you inside it. History rarely repeats in a clean way, but it does reuse emotional patterns. The dot-com bubble left behind a pattern that America has returned to more than once. A real technology appears. Early examples prove that enormous value is possible. Capital rushes in. The language grows grand. Ordinary people are told that old rules may no longer apply. Skeptics are dismissed as lacking imagination. Workers accept risk because the upside might be life-changing. Investors chase the category because missing out feels worse than losing cautiously. Some people become rich. Many do not. Afterward, the surviving technology is used to argue that the excitement was justified, while the human damage is treated as the cost of progress. That phrase, the cost of progress, deserves suspicion. Progress always has costs, but those costs are not distributed by nature. People distribute them. Institutions distribute them. Markets distribute them. Laws, contracts, tax rules, investment structures, and workplace norms decide who is protected and who is exposed. The dot-com bubble made many Americans feel that if the technology was important enough, the distribution of risk did not need to be examined too closely. The crash showed why that was dangerous. A future can be real and still be sold unfairly. A company can be innovative and still be badly run. A worker can be talented and still lose. A market can identify a major trend and still overprice almost every company attached to it. The bubble also took away some faith in the idea that hard work alone would be enough. This may be the deepest wound. Dot-com employees worked hard. Many worked very hard. Long nights, constant deadlines, unstable roles, emotional pressure, high expectations. Yet effort did not guarantee reward. Some who worked hard became wealthy because they were at the right company at the right time and sold before the fall. Others worked just as hard and ended with nothing but experience. That contrast exposed something Americans often prefer not to say plainly. Effort matters, but systems, timing, ownership, and luck matter too. The American dream has always tried to make success feel morally legible. Work hard and rise. The bubble made success look more random, more financial, and more dependent on access to the right moment. For those who lost money in retirement accounts, the lesson was different but related. They had followed the new rules as they understood them. Save through work, invest for the long term, trust funds, trust growth. Let the market help provide what pensions no longer guaranteed. Then they watched a speculative mania damage those savings. Many recovered over time, depending on age, allocation, and whether they stayed invested. But recovery on a chart is not the same as recovery in a life. A person close to retirement cannot always wait a decade. A family that delays a home purchase or college plan feels the loss in decisions, not just percentages. The market may eventually heal, but time does not refund itself. The dot-com bubble also changed how people saw technology companies as employers. The startup had once been sold as a place of liberation from old corporate life. Less hierarchy, more creativity, more ownership, more speed. Some of that remained true in certain companies. But after the bust, workers could see the other side more clearly. Startups could be thrilling, but also unstable. They could speak of openness while keeping financial realities hidden from employees. They could create community while offering little protection when the community ended. They could make people feel chosen until the next funding round failed. The romance did not vanish, but it became a romance with paperwork attached. And still, the internet kept growing. This is the part that can make the story feel unfair. The workers who lost jobs were not wrong to think the internet mattered. The investors who believed online life would expand were not wrong about the direction. The young people who sensed that computers would shape the next economy were not wrong. The crash punished many people not for believing something false, but for believing something true at the wrong price, in the wrong company, under the wrong incentives. That distinction is one of the hardest lessons in economic history. A true trend can still become a bubble. A real future can still destroy people who buy into it too early, too late, or through the wrong vehicle. By the mid-2000s, the web began to feel normal in ways that would have seemed extraordinary a decade earlier. Search improved. Online commerce became more trusted. Broadband replaced the slow, noisy connections many families remembered. Surviving companies became stronger. New companies learned from the failures of the first wave. Investors became more disciplined for a while. Consumers grew more comfortable doing things online that once felt strange. The internet entered daily life not as a fever, but as infrastructure. That success made the bubble seem, to some, like a necessary childhood illness of the digital economy. Painful, excessive, embarrassing, but ultimately part of growing up. There is some truth there, but only if we do not forget the people. Economies are often described as if they mature through impersonal forces. Capital moves, labour adjusts, markets correct, innovation continues. Those phrases are not false, but they are incomplete. Labour adjusting means someone loses a job. Capital moving means a company closes. A market correction means a household loses savings. Innovation continuing means the people hurt by the first version may not be the ones rewarded by the second. The internet economy did grow up, but many of the people who paid for its early mistakes did not receive a share of its later stability. So what did the bubble take from the American dream? It took the confidence that the future would be fair simply because it was new. It took the idea that technology naturally weakens old inequalities rather than creating new forms of them. It took the comfort of believing that ordinary workers become owners just because compensation includes options. It took some of the trust people had placed in experts who sounded certain when they should have sounded cautious. It took time from workers who gave years to companies that vanished. It took savings from people who thought they were investing in progress. It took innocence from a culture that wanted to believe the internet had found a shortcut around the hard problems of work, wages, debt, and security. But it did not take the desire for the dream itself. That is why the story matters. Americans kept reaching. They kept starting companies. They kept investing. They kept moving to new cities, learning new skills, building new tools, and telling themselves that the next version would be wiser than the last. Some of that persistence is admirable. Some of it is exhausting. A country built on reinvention has trouble admitting when reinvention becomes a burden placed on individuals rather than a promise supported by institutions. The dot-com crash did not end the American dream. It made it more anxious. It made it more tied to markets. It made it more dependent on timing. It made it harder to tell the difference between opportunity and exposure. There is one final room I want to sit in before we leave this story. Not a trading floor, not a startup office, not a conference room where bankers prepare an offering. Just a small home office in the early 2000s. A computer sits on a desk. The internet still works. Email still arrives. The web still opens. The technology that promised to change everything is still there, quietly becoming normal. Beside the keyboard is a folder with old stock option papers, or a retirement statement, or a resume printed after a layoff. The person sitting there is not a symbol to themselves. They are just trying to decide what comes next. They believed some of what they were told. Maybe they benefited for a while. Maybe they lost more than they admit. Maybe they are embarrassed. Maybe they are angry. Maybe they still believe in technology, but no longer believe in the people who sell certainty around it. That person is part of the history of the internet too. Not only the founders who survived, not only the companies that became giants, not only the investors who learned to be more careful. The person who had to rebuild after the crash belongs in the story because the American dream is not measured only by the winners who make it onto magazine covers. It is measured by what happens to ordinary people when a national promise fails them. It is measured by whether work leads to security, whether risk is shared honestly, whether progress includes the people asked to pay for it, and whether a country can tell the difference between a future worth building and a sales pitch wrapped around one. The dot-com bubble left America with that question. It is still there, underneath every new technology boom, every new promise that this time everything will be different, every new market that rises faster than ordinary wages, every new worker asked to trade stability for upside. It is there when a company says it is changing the world. It is there when investors say old measures no longer apply. It is there when people feel the familiar pressure of being early or being left behind. The screens are brighter now. The connections are faster. The devices fit in our hands. But the old question remains almost exactly where it was when the Nasdaq began to fall and the cubicle started to empty. Who gets the dream? Who pays for it? And what is left when the price on the screen changes before the life behind it can catch up? Thank you for spending this time here with me. What we followed together was never only a story about websites or stock prices or companies with strange names and expensive commercials. It was a story about belief, work, risk, and the way a country can be persuaded to confuse motion with progress. If any part of this stayed with you, the sock puppet, the paper millionaires, the empty offices, the worker staring at options that no longer meant anything, I would genuinely like to know which moment made the history feel real. Leave it in the comments if you feel like sharing. And if this kind of quiet history speaks to you, the kind that looks closely at ordinary lives inside big events, thank you for being here. Take care of the people in your house tonight. Be careful with promises that arrive too brightly. And when the screen goes dark, remember that not every future offered to you is a dream. Sometimes it is only a price someone else is hoping you will pay.